My brother-in-law Dale has been guiding elk hunters in the Wallowa Mountains for 22 years. He knows that country the way you know your own kitchen in the dark. He knows where the elk bed in August, where the big bulls go when the season opens, which drainages hold water in a dry year, and which run to nothing by September. He knows where the bears fish in September, along the upper reaches of the Mainam River. He knows when the weather is about to turn hard enough to pull everyone off the mountain. He has tracked wounded animals in snow and in rain, and in conditions that would send most people straight back to the truck. He does not spook easily. He does not tell stories he cannot back up. He did not want to tell me this one at all. It came out last August. We were sitting on the tailgate of his truck outside the sporting goods store in Enterprise, Oregon, on Pete's Pond Road, waiting for his client's license to clear. He said it the way people say things they have been holding for a long time. Flat, tired. Like saying it out loud was the last thing he had tried, and he was not sure it was going to help. He said something out there in the upper Mainam drainage is killing Dogman. Before we get into it, let me know where you're watching from and if you've had an encounter like this. Now, I should tell you a few things before we go further. I have been collecting accounts from the Oregon backcountry for a long time. Most of what I collect comes from people who do not want their names used, people who have already been laughed at once or decided the story was not worth the conversation it would cost them. Dale is not like that. Dale is the kind of man who, when something happens that he cannot explain, writes it down in the same small green field notebook he uses to log elk sightings and trail conditions, because to him, it is all just data. What he told me that afternoon on the tailgate, and what I have since pieced together from other hunters, 2 guides who asked for anonymity, and 1 very specific former employee of the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, forms something I have been sitting with for a long time. I do not have a clean explanation for it. I am not sure one exists. Let me walk you through it from the beginning. Dale's first relevant encounter happened in the fall of 2017. He was packing a client, a retired dentist from Bend named Jeff Kessler, into a camp in the upper Mainam Wilderness. The Mainam River drains out of the Eagle Cap Wilderness in Wallowa County, Oregon. That is northeastern Oregon, about as far from the coast and from Portland as you can get while still being in the state. The Eagle Cap Wilderness is the largest wilderness area in Oregon, just under 360,000 acres. And the upper reaches of the Mainam drainage are some of the most remote country in it. The nearest trailhead from Dale's usual hunting camp is a 14-mile pack trip by horse. The nearest paved road is the highway through the town of Mainam, 40 miles to the northwest on the Wallowa River. There is no cell service. There is no radio relay. When you are in that country, you are in it. The wilderness boundary has been in place since 1940. Before that it was national forest. Before that it was Nez Perce country. And before European contact, it had been Nez Perce hunting ground for thousands of years. The Nez Perce called this country Wallowa, meaning land of winding waters. The name survives in Wallowa County, in the Wallowa Mountains, in Wallowa Lake south of Joseph, where the moraines left by Pleistocene glaciers pile up in long ridges at the edge of the valley floor. It is old country. It remembers things.
Quick thing before we move on. I have this book coming out. It's called the Dogman Codex. It's a compilation of all my research and findings. Been working on it for a long time. So if you want to check that out, links down below. Now let's get you back to the video.
Dale and Jeff rode in on October 7th on the main Mainam River Trail, following the river up through Ponderosa Pine, and then into the higher elevation spruce fir zone, where the trail gets steep and the timber closes in. They were camping at a spot Dale had used for 17 years, a flat bench above the river at about 4,600 feet, shielded on the north side by a basalt wall that cuts the wind and opens south to a long grassy meadow where elk come in the mornings. The meadow is a remnant of a glacial lake bottom. The Mainam lakes above it, 4 separate alpine lakes up near the timberline at 7,800 feet, fill and drain through the system each year. The meadow grass stays green later in the fall than the surrounding timber country, and elk use it hard in September and October. Dale had put clients on elk from that bench 14 of his 17 years there. It is a productive camp. They set up on October 7th, glassed the meadow evening of the 7th, and saw elk in the middle distance but nothing close, and turned in early for the 8th. What happened the morning of October 8th, 2017 is where this starts. Dale was up before first light, as he always is. He had the camp stove going and the coffee on and was checking his rifle when he heard something he had not heard before in 22 years of hunting that drainage. From the ridge to the north, above the basalt wall behind camp, there was a sound. He described it to me as the sound a very large piece of wood makes when it is twisted past the point of breaking. A cracking, tearing sound, long and sustained, followed by a heavy impact he felt through the soles of his boots on the frost-hard ground. Then silence. He turned off the camp stove. He sat still for a few minutes listening. Nothing else. He went back to his coffee. When the light was good enough to see the ridge above camp, he saw that a tree was down. A standing dead fir, the kind the Forest Service calls a snag, maybe 16 inches at the base, had been taken down. It was lying across the basalt wall about 120 yards from the tent. He noted it in his green notebook. Snag down, North Ridge, near basalt wall, 0520, wind calm, possible elk or bear. He and Jeff hunted that day without incident. They ate dinner and turned in. The morning of October 9th, Dale was up again before light. Same routine. Coffee on, check the gear, listen to the country for a few minutes before the day starts. It is a habit he has had since his first season's guiding, a quiet early assessment of the environment, the temperature, the wind direction, what the birds are or are not doing, whether the horses are settled or nervous. He pays attention. It is one of the reasons his clients come back. This time, the sound was different. No wood break. What he heard instead was a long, low, resonant call from somewhere up the drainage to the east. He said it was not a bugle. He has heard thousands of bugles over 22 years and knows the sound of a bull elk at every register, from the high, thin whistle of a younger bull to the chest-deep roar of a mature one in full rut. This was not that. It was lower in pitch and longer in duration, 7 or 8 seconds, and it had a quality he struggled to describe to me. He said it sounded like the call had 2 layers to it, as if there were a lower tone underneath the main sound, something you felt in your chest before you fully heard it with your ears. Not an echo, a separate frequency, present simultaneously with the main tone, giving the whole call a depth that no animal he had heard before had managed. He sat with that for a moment, then he got up, took his rifle, walked to the edge of the meadow, and glassed up the drainage toward the east. In the low morning light, about 400 yards to the east at the far edge of the meadow, where the timber comes back in, he saw 2 shapes, standing upright, one facing him and one turned partially away. He said they were both dark, both clearly larger than any bear he had ever seen standing on its hind legs, and both of them absolutely still. He glassed them for a long time. The one facing him never moved. The one turned away shifted its head once, slowly, to look upslope to the east. He watched for 11 minutes. He counted the minutes on his watch. Then the one facing him took 3 steps backward into the timber and was gone, and the second one followed in the same direction. He went back to camp and wrote it in his notebook. It is 0535 approx. 2 large bipedal subjects, East End Meadow, 400 YDs, not bears. Standing posture, full height, dark coloring. One facing camp direction, one facing east up drainage. Departed east into timber. The 7 to 8 second vocalization preceded the sighting by approximately 4 minutes. No aggression. That is what Dale wrote. I have seen the notebook. I have seen this specific page. His handwriting is small and careful, the writing of a man who was taught cursive properly and has kept it up. And the entry looks like everything else in the notebook, like a man recording what happened and nothing more. Jeff Kessler killed a 5-point bull on October 11th. They packed out on the 12th. Dale said nothing to Jeff about what he had seen on the mornings of the 8th and 9th, mostly because he did not know what to say, and partly because it had nothing to do with elk hunting, and Jeff was paying for elk hunting. Dale went back into that same drainage in November with a different client, a woman named Arlene Beckett from Portland, who hunts late season with a rifle when the elk are in the lower elevations. They did not camp where he usually camps. They camped about 1.5 miles downriver because the bench was frozen solid and the trip was uneventful. He saw nothing unusual. Arlene did not get an elk that trip, but she was not particularly disappointed about it. She told Dale on the ride out that just being in that country was worth the trip, which is something people say when they mean it, and also when they are being polite. He could not tell which she meant. He went back in January of 2018, solo, to check trail conditions for the following season. The meadow was under 2 feet of snow. The basalt wall behind the old camp had 3 more snags down along its top edge, taken down since October, all of them fir, all of them lying on the north side of the wall away from camp. He noted in his green notebook that the breakage on each snag was high up, 6 to 8 feet off the ground, and that the breaks were clean, the wood not rotted, in timber that should have held. He spent time with each break, running his hand over the fracture surface. He has worked in timber country his whole life. He has seen snags brought down by wind and by snow loading and by lightning and by bears using them for marking, and he said, the breaks were not any of those, too clean for wind. The breaks were not at the base the way a wind failure goes, but partway up the trunk. and there was no corresponding gouge or scrape on the wood below the break, the way a bear would leave, using its claws and weight to leverage a snag over. These were breaks where something had gripped the trunk high and applied lateral force until the wood gave. There is a gap in Dale's account between the January 2018 solo trip and the fall of 2022 that I glossed over earlier, and I want to fill it in now because it matters to understanding how his thinking changed over that period. He went back into the Upper Manam every fall between 2018 and 2021. He saw something relevant in 2019. He heard the vocalization multiple times in 2020. In 2021, he started doing something he had not done in 17 years of guiding that drainage, which was to ride the north drainage on his way into camp and check it before he set up at the bench. The 2019 incident happened on October 3rd, opening week of the controlled hunt. He was packing in solo, no client yet, doing a camp setup trip. He was about a mile below the bench camp on the main Meenam Trail, moving upstream when one of his mules stopped cold and would not move forward. He has packed mules in that country for 15 years. A mule stops for a reason. He did not push the animal. He got off his horse and stood on the trail and looked upslope through the timber for a few minutes. He did not see anything. The mule was not panicking, was not pulling at its lead. It was simply not going to move in the direction of the trail. He backed the string 20 yards, then moved off trail upslope at an angle, crossing above whatever had stopped the mule on the trail. He rejoined the trail 200 yards above. The mule moved without hesitation the rest of the way to camp. He went back to the stretch of trail where the mule had stopped, on foot, after he had the string tied and camp half set. He spent about 30 minutes there. He found nothing visible, but the ground at the trail's edge had a different quality in one section. A compressed smoothness in the grass and duff that could have been a large animal sitting or lying for some time. The compression was at the edge of the timber, off the trail by about 10 feet, low to the ground, and it covered an area roughly the size of a dining table. He could not determine when it had been made or what had made it. He noted it in his green notebook with a question mark and went back to camp. That fall was the most elk he had seen in the meadow in 5 years. 6 mornings out of 8, elk in the grass before first light, bulls in range on 3 of those mornings. He put his client, a dentist from Medford named Paul Crossan, on a 5-point bull on October 8th. It was one of the most productive hunts he had run on that bench. He did not hear the two-tone vocalization that season and did not see any bipedal figures. He told me he had almost convinced himself by the end of that season that 2017 had been a one-off, something unusual, possibly explainable by a category he just did not have access to. He had not forgotten it. He was not pretending it had not happened. He was just giving it some room to become less certain over time, the way unusual things do when enough ordinary time passes around them. Then 2020. He was in the Upper Manam 3 times in 2020, once in September for preseason scouting, once in October with clients, once in November for a late tag. He heard the two-tone vocalization in September, twice, both times from the direction of the East Ridge, both times in the early morning. He heard it once in October. He did not hear it in November. The September hearings unsettled the work he had done in his head over 2019, because the vocalization was distinctive enough that it did not leave room for the kind of second-guessing he had been doing. Once he heard it again, he could not go back to the earlier rationalizations. It was a specific and unusual sound, and he had heard it 6 times now, spread across 3 years in the same drainage. Always from the east, always in the early morning, always with that sub-bass quality that he felt in his chest rather than simply heard with his ears. He started asking around, carefully, among the other guides who worked the Meenam and the adjacent drainages. Not direct questions. Guides do not ask each other direct questions about unusual things they have seen, at least not right away, not until there is a level of trust established. He asked about game sign. He asked about trail conditions. He asked what other guides were seeing in the upper country. Over the course of the 2020 and 2021 hunting seasons, he had 4 separate conversations with 3 different guides who worked eastern Wallowa County regularly. And from those conversations, he pulled several things without ever asking directly about them. One guide, a man who operates in the upper Lostine drainage north of the Meenam, mentioned in passing that his pack stock had been difficult to settle at camp for the past 2 seasons, in a way they were not difficult below the wilderness boundary. He said horses that behaved perfectly at the lower elevations developed a watchfulness at elevation that he could not account for by terrain or weather. He had put new animals in and had the same result. It was not the animals, he thought. It was the country at altitude. He did not elaborate, and Dale did not ask him to. A second guide, who works the Imnaha country, told Dale that he had found a dead elk in a tributary drainage in October of 2020 that he could not explain. He did not describe the condition in detail. He said it was not right and left it at that. Dale asked him if he had reported it. The guide said he had decided it was not worth the paperwork. A third guide, a woman who has been operating in the Wallowa wilderness longer than most, and who asked me not to identify her at all when I mentioned her to Celia, told Dale in a conversation in Enterprise in December of 2020 that she had stopped camping in a particular drainage on the east side of the wilderness after 2018. She had used that drainage for 11 years. She did not give Dale a reason, and he did not push for one. He understood from the way she said it that the reason was not something she was prepared to put into a sentence, and that was enough. None of these conversations were about the same thing Dale had seen in 2017. Or maybe they were. He could not know, and they could not tell him. What he took from those 4 conversations was that he was not carrying an isolated experience. That other people who worked the high country in northeastern Oregon were navigating something they were also not talking about directly, and that the not talking about it was a considered choice rather than an absence of information. The information was there. People were just keeping it inside the professional community in the same way Dale had been keeping his own account inside his green notebook. He started the 2021 season with a different approach. He did not change what he did or how he worked the bench camp. He kept his notebook, kept his early morning meadow checks, kept his clients on elk, but he started paying attention to a different set of things. He watched the meadow edge on the south side as carefully as the east side. He started noting the behavior of his horses and mules at camp, whether they were settled or watchful, whether they showed the kind of low-grade unease that stock animals in that country sometimes showed near the end of the season when the elk rut had passed and the country was quiet. He started noting the raven activity above the drainage, which ravens were present when and in which directions they moved. He has trapped and hunted and worked in that country for 22 years, and he knows that ravens do not miss large carcasses, and that the direction ravens fly from a ridge can tell you something about what is happening on the other side of it. In September of 2021, 3 weeks before his first client came in, he rode the north drainage for the first time. He had not had a reason to go up there in years. The hunting was better in the south and east, and the north drainage was brushy and difficult, the kind of country that is hard to glass and harder to pack through. He rode it for about 4 miles before the terrain made continuing impractical on horseback. He did not see anything unusual. The sign was normal: elk tracks, deer, bear, all what he expected. But in a section of trail about 3 miles in, he found a tree that had been stripped of its bark at about 7 feet off the ground in a pattern that he recognized from the basalt wall behind his bench camp. Same height, same pressing in quality rather than a raking or a claw mark. One tree, not 4 in sequence like Russ Lund had found. One tree, marked once, the wood pale and clean where the bark had been taken off, weeks old at most. He photographed it. He wrote about it in the green notebook. He did not go farther up the north drainage that day. That was September 2021. The following spring, in March 2022, he called Celia Broadhurst. He did not know who she was. He had found her through a mutual contact in the conservation community, someone who told him she was a former ODFW biologist who had been asking quiet questions in the guiding community, and who could be trusted with the kind of information Dale had been sitting on. He called her from his truck in the parking lot of the feed store in Baker City and talked to her for 2 hours. He told her everything he had written down from 2017 onward. She listened and asked questions that told him she already knew the shape of some of what he was describing, that his account was fitting into a framework she had already started building from other sources. That 2-hour phone call in March 2022 is when Dale started to understand that what he had been seeing in the Upper Menam was not an isolated anomaly. It was part of a pattern, and the pattern was larger and older than anything he had imagined. He spent 2 hours there before riding back out. He did not see anything unusual, but he heard the 2-tone vocalization once, briefly, from the ridge to the east in the early afternoon. Clear sky, no wind. He wrote it down. I'm going to describe the country to you more carefully, because the geography matters to what comes later. The Upper Menam River drainage runs roughly east to west through the central Eagle Cap wilderness. The river itself drops about 1,600 feet over the 12 miles from its headwaters to where it enters the lower wilderness, and the character of the country changes. The headwaters are above 7,000 feet, above timberline, open granite and talus. The country where Dale camps is lower, between 4,400 and 5,200 feet, in the Engelmann spruce and subalpine fir zone, with meadows in the valley bottom and dense timber on the north-facing slopes. The south-facing slopes are open and dry, bunch grass and rock, with isolated timber in the steeper draws. This is Rocky Mountain elk country, as good as it gets in the Pacific Northwest. The mule deer use the high country in summer and drop into the lower drainages in November. The black bears are abundant. Cougars are present throughout, well documented by the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, with several hundred resident animals in northeastern Oregon's wolf management zones. The wolves, specifically the Imnaha pack and its offshoots, have been documented in Wallowa County since at least 2011, though the packs have shifted territory substantially over the past decade as the population expanded and contracted in response to management and prey dynamics. A family living outside Enterprise told me that in some winters they can hear the packs working the canyon rims above town. It is that kind of country, full of things, and old. The Wallowa Mountains themselves are not part of the same geological system as the Cascades or the Blue Mountains. They are the exposed core of a granitic batholith, an intrusion of magma into older oceanic crust that was then buried under younger volcanic rock and later exposed as the surrounding material eroded. The Triassic oceanic terrains that the batholith intruded into are some of the oldest exposed rock in Oregon, carried here on tectonic plates from somewhere far south in the ancient Pacific. The canyon country along the Snake River to the east, Hell's Canyon, cuts down through those same terrains on its way to the Snake. It is a deeply old place, geologically speaking, and that is relevant because the ecology of a deep-time landscape is different from the ecology of a recently reset one. The Cascades, for all their drama, are geologically young. The Wallowas have been around in roughly their current form for much longer, and the communities of organisms living in them have had time to develop relationships and hierarchies and dependencies that more recently assembled landscapes have not had time to establish. I mention this because Celia Broadhurst, who I will get to shortly, made this point to me directly. She said that one of the things she has come to believe is that the existence of something like what she has documented in the Wallowas is not surprising if you take the deep-time ecology of the place seriously. Not all apex relationships in an ecosystem are visible to human observers. Not all of them operate on timescales that make them legible to a field biologist running 3-year population studies. Some of the structuring relationships in old-growth ecological communities have developed over thousands of years and are not apparent from the kinds of data that wildlife management agencies typically collect. That is a careful way of saying that something can be real and present and ecologically significant in a landscape and still be invisible to the monitoring apparatus that is supposed to detect it. She is talking about the second entity. I will get to that. What Dale described seeing on those October mornings, and what the subsequent physical evidence suggested, fit a pattern I had heard pieces of from 3 other sources before I ever spoke to Dale on that tailgate. I had not connected those pieces until he started talking. I want to tell you about those sources now, in the order I encountered them, because the order matters. The first was a man named Russ Lund. Russ is 61 years old, and he is a licensed hunting guide who operates primarily in the Hell's Canyon country along the Snake River, on the Oregon side, specifically the draw country above the canyon rim, in the Wallowa-Whitman National Forest between Halfway and Oxbow. He is not a man who entertains nonsense. He runs a tight professional operation, and his clients come back year after year, which in the guiding business is the only review that matters. He has a reputation in the Northeast Oregon guiding community for finding Elkin's terrain that other guides do not bother with, the steep, ugly coulee country above the canyon rim where the hunting is genuinely difficult, but where the big bulls go when the pressure in the easier country gets too heavy. I met Russ through a mutual contact in the conservation community about 3 years ago. At the time, he told me he had seen something in Hell's Canyon he could not explain, but that he was not prepared to talk about it publicly. He said this matter-of-factly, the way you might say you had seen something in someone's face that told you they were lying, but you were not going to call them on it in public. He was just not ready. He called me in March of 2023 and said he was ready. Hell's Canyon is the deepest river gorge in North America. The Snake River cuts 8,000 feet below the highest surrounding rim over a horizontal distance of about 10 miles, which gives you some sense of the scale of what you are looking at when you stand on the Oregon rim and peer east into Idaho. The Idaho side is managed as the Hell's Canyon National Recreation Area and draws significant recreational use. The Oregon side is a mix of national forest, BLM land, and private ranching, going back to the homestead era, a patchwork of ownership that makes management complicated and keeps some of the country genuinely private and rarely visited. In the draw country above the canyon rim on the Oregon side, in the Wallowa-Whitman National Forest, between the tiny communities of Halfway and Richland, the terrain is characterized by deep north-facing coulees cut down from the plateau into the canyon walls, open bunchgrass slopes going south, and isolated timber in the steeper draws. The elk populations in this country are significant, and the hunting pressure, while real, is limited by the access difficulty. You cannot drive to most of the good elk country. You ride in or you walk. Most people choose not to. Russ has been hunting and guiding that country for 19 years. He knows the drainages the way Dale knows the Menam. He knows where the elk are in September, when the bulls are still in bachelor groups on the high ridges. And he knows where they go in October, when the rut changes everything. And he knows which north-facing coulees hold the late-season bulls, when the snow has pushed the elk down toward the river. He knows the sign. He knows what belongs there and what does not. In September of 2019, a week before the archery elk season opened, he was doing a pre-season camp inspection trip into a drainage he uses regularly, which he asked me not to identify by name for reasons that will become clear. He was traveling solo, 3 horses, staying 3 nights, checking the condition of the camp and the trail, and glassing for elk to know where they were when the season started. The weather was clear and warm for early September in that country, highs in the mid-60s at rim elevation, dropping to the 40s overnight. Good conditions, a pleasant trip by the standards of what he usually does. On the second morning, he found elk, not living elk, dead ones. In a clearing about half a mile from his camp, at the edge of the timber above a small spring, he found 4 elk carcasses. They were not the result of a legal kill. There was no hunter camp nearby. There was no gut pile in the normal sense. The carcasses were stripped of their hides in large sections, as if the hide had been peeled rather than cut. The bones were present and largely intact. The organs had been removed, but not in the way a predator removes organs. A wolf, or a bear, or a mountain lion tears into a carcass. The body cavity is opened from the softest point, typically the flank, and the contents are pulled out and consumed or scattered, and the pattern is one of urgency and opportunism, because a predator at a kill is aware it may need to defend or abandon the resource at any moment. What Russ found was different. The body cavities were open, and the organs were absent, but the cuts were clean. That is the word he kept using. Clean. Deliberate. The kind of precision you see in a butchering operation conducted by someone who knows what they are doing and is not in a hurry. He walked around all 4 carcasses for nearly 2 hours. He has killed and dressed many hundreds of elk in his career. He knows elk anatomy the way a person knows the back of their hand. He said the pattern of what had been done to those animals did not match anything he recognized. The hides had been peeled back in strips that began at specific anatomical landmarks: the hip joint, the shoulder, the jawline, and the strips were uniform in width and the edges were consistent throughout their length. Something had done this following a method, the same method on all 4 carcasses. He found no tracks at the site beyond elk tracks leading in and not out. He found no scat. He found no hair caught on the brush around the clearing that would indicate a large predator had been present. He found no sign that a pack of animals had worked the site. No drag paths from multiple feeding positions. No territory marking, nothing that matched a typical carnivore kill event. He found one thing he could not account for. Along the edge of the clearing, on the east side, the bark of 4 separate ponderosa pines had been stripped at a height of about 7 feet off the ground, and into each stripped section, something had been pressed or raked, creating a series of vertical gouges. The gouges were not random, not scattered. 4 trees, evenly spaced, each with the same type of mark at the same height, as if something had made a deliberate mark on each one in sequence, moving east along the clearing's edge. He photographed all of it. He has the photographs. I have seen copies. He contacted the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife on his way home, and spoke to a regional wildlife biologist named Terrence Ogle, who covers the Wallowa Union County area. He sent Ogle the photographs. Ogle told him that the carcasses were consistent with wolf depredation, which is the standard agency explanation for any unusual ungulate mortality in the area, since wolves returned to northeastern Oregon in 2009, when the Imnaha pack was documented in Wallowa County. Russ pushed back on this. He is not a man who accepts a bad answer because it came from an official source. He knows what wolf kills look like. He has seen many of them, particularly in the years after the Imnaha pack established in Wallowa County, and ranchers began losing livestock. He has seen what wolves do to elk they have killed cooperatively. He told Ogle that was not a wolf kill. Ogle told him he understood his concern, and that the photos would be added to the regional mortality documentation, and that he could not speak to what else might be operating in that country, but that all known large predators in the state were accounted for under current monitoring. All known large predators. Russ asked what that sentence meant, specifically. Ogle paused for a moment. Then he said he was not in a position to discuss monitoring data that was not part of the public record. That was the end of the conversation. Now I want to bring in a third source, and this is where the shape of what we are dealing with starts to come into focus. Her name is Celia Broadhurst. She worked for the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife for 14 years, from 2003 to 2017, as a field biologist in the large carnivore program. She holds a master's degree in wildlife ecology from Oregon State University, earned in 2001, and spent the better part of a decade doing telemetry work and population monitoring on wolves, cougars, and black bears in northeastern Oregon. She has crawled through terrain that most people would not consider passable. She has sat in hides for 20 hours waiting for an animal to enter a survey area. She has handled wolves under chemical immobilization for collaring work, and she has, on 2 occasions, tracked a wounded cougar with only a handful of daylight left, and the knowledge that if she lost the track, she was going to have to come back and start over in the dark. She is not someone who frightens easily, and she is not someone who reaches for explanations that she cannot support with evidence. She left the agency in 2017. She will not say publicly why she left. When I asked her directly, she said only that she had disagreed with leadership about the appropriate scope of what the large carnivore program should be monitoring, and that the disagreement was not resolvable, and she left. She now teaches biology at a community college in La Grande, Oregon. She agreed to speak with me on the condition that I not characterize anything she said as official information from the agency. It is her personal account and her personal interpretation. She is not speaking for ODFW. What Celia told me begins in January of 2015. The large carnivore program in northeastern Oregon was doing what it typically does in winter, checking trap sites, running telemetry on collared animals, and investigating any unusual mortality reports that came in from hunters, ranchers, and other observers. In January of 2015, a mortality report came in from a USFS wilderness ranger who had been doing a winter conditions check on a trail in the Upper Minam drainage. The ranger had found tracks in the snow, bipedal tracks, at a size that did not correspond to any known species. She had documented and photographed them. The report went to the large carnivore program as a standard referral because bipedal tracks of unusual size, in the agency's working protocol, are first assessed as possible bear encounters before any further investigation is warranted. Celia was assigned to evaluate the report. She drove up to the Wallowas and hiked in on snowshoes to the location, a round trip of about 22 miles. The tracks were 3 days old but still readable in the consolidated snow. She measured them and photographed them and took notes and came back out and filed her evaluation. She described the tracks as bipedal, with a stride length of approximately 60 to 64 inches and a foot impression measuring between 15 and 16 inches in length and 7 inches in width, with 5 toes showing and a distinct arch. She noted that the track depth was consistent with a subject weight of at minimum 400 pounds and more likely 500 or above. She noted that the track pattern indicated a fluid, balanced bipedal gait, not a knuckle walker occasionally rising up, but a habitual biped, something that walked on 2 feet as its primary mode of locomotion, and had been doing so long enough to develop the associated musculoskeletal adaptations that produce a confident, grounded stride. She wrote that the tracks matched no known species in Oregon or in North America in the peer-reviewed literature. She filed the evaluation. 2 days later, she was called in and told by the program director to refile it with a different conclusion, specifically that the tracks were consistent with a large black bear walking bipedally on compacted snow. She refused. There is a short, terse exchange of emails about this that Celia has saved. She did not share the emails with me, but she described them in detail and told me their content. The evaluation was refiled without her signature, with the bear attribution. She was moved to a different assignment. She said nothing about this to anyone outside the agency for 6 years. In the fall of 2021, she started reaching out quietly to people she trusted in the hunting and guiding community. She was not trying to make a public statement. She was trying to understand whether what she had found in the Minam drainage in January of 2015 was an isolated event or part of a pattern. She was doing what scientists do when they have a data point that does not fit the model, but they are not yet sure whether the model is wrong or the data point is an outlier. She was looking for corroboration or for evidence that would put the question to rest. She called Russ Lund in 2022. He told her about the September 2019 carcasses in the Hells Canyon country. She called my brother-in-law Dale in 2023. He told her about the October 2017 mornings in the Upper Minam, and about the January 2018 solo trip, and about everything that came after. She has since spoken to 11 other people in the guiding and hunting community in northeastern Oregon, all of whom had at least one account they had never filed officially. She has been building what she calls a pattern of corroborating physical evidence across a geographic area of approximately 2,000 square miles in the Wallowa Mountains and adjacent terrain. I asked her what she thinks the pattern shows. She was quiet for a moment, a long moment. Then she said, "There are two separate things happening in this country, and people have been conflating them, or seeing only one or the other. And the conflation is why the accounts have never added up into anything coherent." She said there are the Dogman accounts. The bipedal, large, dark-furred sightings that fit the description people have been reporting from the Pacific Northwest for at least a century, and from eastern Oregon specifically, for as long as there have been people going into this country and coming back out with stories. Upright, heavy, typically in the 6 to 8 foot range, observed moving through terrain at a pace inconsistent with a bear or with any other known quadruped, occasionally going bipedal. The track record for those accounts in northeastern Oregon goes back to the early 20th century in the public record and much further in the oral traditions of the Nez Perce, who have language for the upright beings of the high country that predates any European contact with the region. Those, she said, are real. Whatever they are real, and they have been part of the ecology of this country for at minimum 100 years of documented observation, and very likely much longer. The second thing, she said, is different. The second thing is what makes the carcasses, what makes the clean stripped hides and the precisely removed organs, what leaves the bark marks at height, what makes the two-tone vocalization, the low-resonant double-layered call that Dale heard in the October morning above his camp, and heard again in January of 2018, the sound with the frequency underneath that you feel in your chest before you hear it with your ears. The second thing is not the Dogman. She does not think it is related to the Dogman. She thinks, based on the spatial data she has assembled over 4 years, that it is hunting the Dogman. She said that carefully. She paused before the word hunting and said it with the precision of a person who has considered whether a less charged word would be more accurate, and decided that hunting was, in fact, the right word for what the evidence describes. She said that the geographic pattern shows that the carcass and disturbance events, the stripping, the clean removal, the bark marks, tend to cluster in areas where there has been a prior documented concentration of Dogman sign, track evidence, vocalizations, direct human sightings, and then, following the disturbance events, the Dogman sign goes quiet, for months, sometimes for multiple seasons. She thinks something is moving through this country and clearing it. Let me stop here and give you the context you need to understand why this land specifically might produce something like this, because I think it matters. The Wallowa Mountains are genuinely ancient terrain. The Wallowa County geology includes some of the oldest exposed rock in Oregon, Triassic oceanic crust, accreted to the continent roughly 200 million years ago, overlaid in the valleys by younger Cenozoic volcanic material and glacial deposits. The granite batholith at the core of the Eagle Cap is a Cretaceous age intrusion, the same general geological era as the Sierra Nevada. The wilderness sits at the junction of 3 major ecoregions, which is ecologist language for saying that the habitat diversity here is extreme. In a single drainage, you go from arid bunchgrass canyon at 1,000 feet to alpine meadow and exposed granite at 9,000 feet in 20 horizontal miles. That kind of compressed ecological gradient supports an extraordinary density and diversity of large mammals. The elk population in Wallowa County is one of the highest density Rocky Mountain elk populations anywhere in their range. The Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife estimates the Wallowa herd at somewhere between 11,000 and 14,000 animals, depending on the year. The mule deer population is substantial. The pronghorn use the lower plateau country. Bears are present throughout. Wolves have been documented in multiple family groups. The biodiversity of the high country is legitimately exceptional for a temperate montane system. If you were something large, something that required large prey to sustain itself, and you wanted to live somewhere remote enough to stay off the human radar and productive enough to feed you, the Wallowa wilderness would be on a very short list. The combination of prey abundance, terrain complexity, and genuine remoteness is not easy to find anywhere in the lower 48 states in the quantities that exist here. I want to come back now to Dale and to what happened in the fall of 2022, because that is the account that changed how I understood everything else. Dale went back into the Upper Minam in October of 2022 with 2 clients, a father and son from Boise named Clint and Marco Harwick. Clint was 63 and a veteran hunter who had been on 7 or 8 guided trips over his lifetime, comfortable in the backcountry, not the kind of client who makes a guide nervous. Marco was 31 and in his 2nd season. He had the eagerness of a new hunter and a willingness to work that Clint told Dale privately had not been present in his son for most of his 20s, which was why they were doing this trip together. Dale's pack string was 3 horses and 2 mules. They rode in on October 9th on the main Minam Trail and set up on the usual bench. The first 2 days were slow. They glassed the meadow morning and evening and saw elk in the middle distance, but nothing close enough or positioned right. On the morning of October 12th, before first light, Dale heard the vocalization. The same two-tone call he had heard on the mornings of October 8th and 9th, 2017, and again in January of 2018. It came from up the drainage to the east, as before. He got up and went to the meadow edge and glassed toward the sound with his Swarovski binocular. The light was barely adequate, the sky just beginning to show gray at the east horizon above the ridgeline. He could see the far end of the meadow and the dark wall of the timber beyond. There was something in the meadow, one thing. Standing upright at the edge of the timber on the north side, about 350 yards away. He said it was very large, larger than what he had seen in 2017. He was on a tripod this time, glassing with a 10-power eyepiece, and in the available light, the shape was dark, very dark, and it was not looking at him. It was looking south across the meadow. Still. He watched for 4 minutes. It did not move. Then, from the south side of the meadow, from the timber on the opposite side, there was a sound he could not immediately categorize. He swung his glass south. In the timber on the south edge of the meadow, something was moving. He could not get a clear look at it in the trees. He had the impression of something dark and fast, moving in a way that the timber trunks interrupted at irregular intervals. There then, not there then, there again, as it crossed between them. And it was moving in the direction of the large standing figure on the north edge. The figure on the north edge saw it too. It turned, faced south. What happened next took about 20 seconds. Dale counted, and then wrote it down. The figure on the north edge made a sound that was not the two-tone vocalization. This was different, short, percussive. He said it was like a very large, very heavy rock striking another rock once. Hard, but coming from a throat. A single sharp impact vocalization with no sustained tone. Then it turned, and in 3 or 4 very fast strides, it was in the timber and gone. The thing moving in the south timber stopped. Completely stopped. It was in the trees, and Dale could not see it clearly enough to describe it. He said he had the impression of 2 points of dim reflected light at a height well above where a bear's eyes would be if a bear were standing on its hind legs. Then the sky lightened another degree, dawn coming up faster now, and whatever was in the south timber was gone. Dale stood at the meadow edge for a few minutes. He was processing what he had seen, running it against what he knew, looking for an explanation that fit. He could not find one. Then he went back to camp, got his clients up, told them they were hunting the north drainage today, away from the meadow, and he did not explain why. He made them coffee and they rode north and were away from camp by first light. He wrote 5 pages in the green notebook that morning, back at camp, while the clients were away hunting north. I have read all 5 pages. He described what he had seen and what he concluded from it. He wrote that the large figure on the north edge of the meadow had been aware of whatever was in the south timber before Dale had issued a warning sound of some kind and then departed the meadow rapidly. That the thing in the south timber had moved in a way that was, in his words, nothing like anything I have in my categories. He wrote that whatever was in the south timber had been moving toward the figure on the north edge with a purpose he recognized from watching predators work their whole working lives, and that the figure on the north edge had recognized it too. He wrote at the bottom of the last page, "Something out here is hunting something else that people have decided is impossible, and the thing being hunted knows it. Clint Harwick killed a good bull on October 14th, a mature 6-point in the north drainage, and Marco wounded a cow elk that they tracked for 4 hours before finding it and making a clean finishing shot, which is not the experience you want as a new hunter, but is the kind of experience that teaches you more than any easy kill would." Dale packed both animals out over 2 days. They rode home on October 16th. Dale drove south from Wallowa County to his house in Baker City and sat on his porch for a while before going inside. He told me on the tailgate that night in Enterprise was the first time he had thought seriously about whether he wanted to keep running that camp. He decided he would. He has been running that drainage for 17 years, and his clients expect it, and he expects it of himself, and whatever is in that meadow has given him no reason to think he is personally in danger. He said that about 3 times in our conversation, in different ways, and I do not think he was trying to convince me. I think he was rechecking his own reasoning, the way you do when you have made a decision you are not entirely sure about. Let me tell you about Celia's site documentation, because this is the physical evidence that underlies everything else. Over the past 4 years, Celia has documented through interviews and field verification 12 separate sites in the Wallowa Mountains and adjacent terrain where she has found the combination of evidence she associates with what she calls the second entity, the one that is not Dogman. The 12 sites share a consistent set of characteristics: large ungulate mortality with evidence of controlled, methodical hide removal and organ extraction. Not scavenging, not predator feeding, but something that went to the carcasses with a method and followed it. Bark stripping on trees at a consistent height of 6 to 8 feet, with impressions suggesting the stripping was done by something pressing into the wood rather than raking it, a pushing or gripping force rather than a claw drag. Soil disturbance in patterns around the mortality site that do not correspond to the typical rooting or digging of known scavengers. In 2 of the 12 sites, Celia found what she described to me as ground depressions, oval in shape, pressed into the soil at the base of trees, that appeared to be rest or waiting positions used by something very heavy. She estimated the weight of the subject from the area and depth of the depressions at between 700 and 900 pounds, which is significantly larger than a Kodiak bear, the largest known bear subspecies in North America, whose males average between 800 and 1,400 pounds, but are found in Alaska, not Oregon. The black bears of the Wallowas typically run between 150 and 400 pounds. Even the largest documented black bears in Oregon, animals taken by hunters over the past 20 years, run under 500 pounds. In 7 of the 12 sites, there was prior documented Dogman activity in the surrounding area. Track evidence, vocalizations, sightings by hunters or guides in the season or seasons preceding the disturbance event. In all 7 of those sites, the Dogman sign ceased following the disturbance event and had not returned to those locations at the time Celia last checked. She has documented 2 instances where a Dogman was directly observed in proximity to what she believes was the second entity, and in both cases, the Dogman departed rapidly. The word she used for the speed of departure was flight. Not withdrawal, not retreat, not ceding territory in the careful way that apex predators do when they encounter a competitor at a kill. Flight, the kind of departure you see in prey animals, the break that happens when the fear response overwhelms the territorial one and the body just goes. These observations were made by guides in 2 separate drainages. Both guides asked not to be identified. Both gave Celia detailed statements. She verified both accounts through follow-up site visits and independent physical documentation. The second of those accounts involves a second witness. I am going to tell you that account now. There is a guide who operates in the upper Imnaha country on the east side of the Eagle Cap Wilderness, and who asked me specifically to identify him only as a guide working the east side, and not to use his name or the specific drainage. He has been guiding in that country for 16 years. In September of 2021, he was doing a preseason archery scouting trip with a single client, a longtime hunter he had worked with many times and who was equally uninterested in being identified publicly. They were 4 miles up a drainage from the last forest road, on foot, camping light. The upper Imnaha country is different from the Menam. The Imnaha River drains the southeast side of the Eagle Cap into the Snake River at the small community of Imnaha, Oregon, and its upper forks reach back into the highest elevations of the wilderness. The terrain is more open than the Menam, with extensive above timberline country on the east-facing slopes and large parks and meadows in the headwater bowls. The elk in the upper Imnaha tend to be bigger-bodied than the Menam elk, likely because of the higher quality forage in the open country, and the hunting pressure, despite the country's productivity, is lower because the access is genuinely difficult even by the standards of the Eagle Cap. There is no maintained trail for the last several miles of the approach the guide uses. On September 4, 2021, at approximately 0700, in clear weather with good morning light, the guide was glassing a south-facing slope above the drainage when he saw, through his binocular, a single large bipedal figure moving through the timber on the far side of the drainage. He said it was moving along a bench above the river at a pace he estimated at 3 to 4 miles per hour. 3 to 4 miles per hour is fast walking for a human on flat ground and essentially impossible in broken timber terrain for any sustained distance. The figure was dark, very large, and its gait was fluid and unhurried despite the speed, the efficiency of something moving in its own country with no resistance. He watched it for about 90 seconds before it moved into denser timber and was no longer visible. He told his client, who confirmed he had also seen it with his unaided eye. They discussed it for a few minutes standing on the slope and decided to move upslope to get a better glassing angle on the bench where the figure had been traveling. They climbed for about 40 minutes on steep terrain and set up on a rocky outcrop above the bench. From that position, they had a view of approximately 2 miles of bench country and the ridge above it. What they saw next is what they both sat with for a long time before the guide called Celia. The bipedal figure they had seen was visible again at the east end of the bench where the bench narrows and the terrain steepens toward the ridge. It had stopped. It was facing back to the west in the direction it had come from. The guide said its posture had changed entirely. The fluid, unhurried movement of the earlier sighting was gone. Something had replaced it that he described, carefully, as concentrated alertness. The way a deer stands when it has heard something, and is putting all of its processing into determining what it heard and where it came from. Except that the guide said a deer, even a mature buck in that posture, has a quality of potential flight in it, a coiled readiness that is one assessment away from a run. What he was seeing on the bench did not have that quality. It was alert, and it was still, but it was not coiled. It was standing the way a thing stands when it has not yet decided whether to run. He glanced back west, down the bench, in the direction the figure was looking. Coming along the bench from the west, from the direction the figure had come from, was something else. This is where the guide's description became very deliberate and very controlled, and where the independent account from his client, which Celia took separately and did not share between the two men until both statements were complete, became the thing that changed how Celia understood what her 12 sights represented. The guide described what he saw as dark, as the first figure was dark, but much heavier in the body and lower to the ground at the shoulders, as if the rear of the body sat higher than the front. He said it moved in a way that he at first thought might be a large bear at a dead run, which in the Wallowa country is not an implausible thing to see. Then he realized it could not be a bear because the limb pattern was wrong. Not a typical quadruped bounding at speed, the two front feet touching down together, ahead of the two back feet in the galloping pattern every large mammal uses when it is moving fast. What he was seeing was different, something between a quadruped and a biped, using its arms, if they were arms, in a way that gave it leverage on the slope rather than simple locomotor support, pressing them into the terrain to power the body forward and uphill, the way a sprinter uses their arms not just for balance but as part of the engine. He said the speed was significant. He estimated it was covering the bench at a pace that was closing ground on the first figure fast. The first figure made a sound. The guide heard it clearly across the canyon. He described it as 2 syllables, sharp, with no sustained tone, a warning or a distress call or something in between. Then, it turned and ran. He has watched elk run their whole working lives. He has watched mule deer, which are, pound for pound, among the fastest ungulates in North America. He has watched black bears, which are faster than most people expect, and genuinely athletic animals. He said the thing running on the bench was moving at a speed that was, in his words, not a fair contest. Within 30 seconds, the bipedal figure had reached the end of the bench and gone up into the steep talus toward the ridge. Within another 30 seconds, the second thing reached the point where the bipedal figure had been standing and stopped. It stood at the edge of the bench. It was in the open. The guide had a clear, unobstructed view of it. He looked at it for 11 seconds. He told Celia he knows it was 11 seconds because he counted. Then it turned and descended the bench the way it had come. He and his client sat on the rock for a very long time, without talking. Then they went down and got back into their camp and broke camp and walked out that same day. They did not go back into that drainage that season. The guide did not tell anyone other than Celia, and only after she had told him about the other sites and made it clear she was not going to publish anything and was only trying to understand the pattern. When he described the thing standing at the bench edge to Celia, he used precise language, the language of someone who is aware that they are describing something unusual and wants to get it right. He said it was very large. He said the shoulders were disproportionately wide relative to the body length, wider than would be proportionally normal for any primate he was aware of. He said the neck was short and the head was low on the body, in a way that was not like a primate's head placement, more forward, more as if the skull grew from the top of the chest rather than from the top of a distinct neck. He said the coloring was not uniform, dark brown or black, the way the first figure's coloring had been. There were areas of the body that were paler, not quite gray but lighter, at the shoulders and the upper chest, as if the fur or hair in those areas was different in color or texture from the rest. He said the hands, and he called them hands without qualification, were resting at the lateral edges of the body in a way that suggested they were very long, possibly longer relative to body length than a human's hands, and that the posture of them was relaxed, an animal that has just run a competitor off a bench and has no need to hurry. The client's account, taken separately, matched on every significant point the guide had included. Length of the observation, 11 seconds. The paler coloring at the shoulders, the low head placement, the relaxed posture of the hands, the speed with which it had closed the distance on the bipedal figure. Celia shared both statements with me on the condition that I characterize them as independent first-person accounts and not as scientific conclusions. She has not published anything about any of this. She does not think the current evidentiary base supports a formal publication in the peer-reviewed literature. which requires not just witness accounts and physical site evidence, but biological samples and, ideally, imaging. She does not have biological samples. She has no track cast from the upper Imneha. She has no photograph from any of the 12 sites. Dale does. Dale set up a trail camera on the bench above his camp after the 2022 incident. He mounted it on a tree at the east end of the meadow, aimed at the timber edge on October 17, 2022, the day after his clients rode out. He left it active. He checked it in April of 2023 on a solo ride in to assess trail conditions for the coming season. The camera had recorded 847 events over the winter months. Most were wind-triggered or light-triggered, false positives from the motion and temperature differential detection system. Forests produce a lot of false triggers in winter, but 7 of the events were genuine. 5 were elk, including one sequence of 12 images showing 3 cows and a yearling moving through the meadow in early November. 1 was a black bear in late October. 1 was not an elk or a bear. The last event was from December 14, 2022. The camera recorded 2 images at 2:43 a.m. and at 2:47 a.m. The ambient temperature at the camera location that night, based on the closest SnowTel automated snow and climate station at the Minam Lake site, was 9 degrees Fahrenheit. Clear sky. Light snow fell sometime between 2 samig and 4 dir a.m. based on the depth change at the SnowTel site. The 243 image shows the edge of the meadow and the timberline at the far end, about 60 yards from the camera. There is something at the timber edge. It is dark. The camera is a standard consumer trail camera using passive infrared detection, imaging in black and white at night, detecting heat differentials against the background temperature. At 9 degrees Fahrenheit, the differential between the ambient environment and a warm-blooded subject is substantial, and a subject generating significant body heat shows up bright in the infrared. The subject in the 243 image is bright. It is upright. The image is not perfectly sharp because the subject is at the far edge of the camera's effective detection range, and there was light snow falling. But it is clearly upright, clearly large, and it is facing the camera. The 247 image shows the same location. The subject has not moved in 4 minutes. There are no further images from that night. Dale showed me those images on his phone on that August afternoon in the parking lot of the sporting goods store in Enterprise. I spent a long time on them. I am not a wildlife professional, and I will not tell you I can make a definitive species identification from a grainy infrared night shot taken at 60 yards in a 9-degree snowfall. What I can tell you is that what is in those images does not look like any animal I have ever seen in a trail camera photograph. And I have looked at a very large number of trail camera photographs over the years I have been doing this work. The subject's posture is fully erect. The height relative to the timber behind it, trees whose approximate size Dale knows because he has worked around them for 17 years and has felled snags within 50 yards of them, is consistent with a subject between 7 and 8 feet tall. The arms are visible at the sides. They are long. The head is distinct from the shoulders. The skull shape, in silhouette, is narrow at the crown in a way that is inconsistent with a bear's rounded skull profile. That is what the images show. I will not describe them as showing anything more than that. I'm going to pause here for a moment, because what comes next involves what happened in November of 2023, and I want to give you a clear picture of what Celia has assembled before I get there, because the November events are the most significant physical evidence in this entire account. Celia has identified an elevation boundary in her data. The disturbance events, the carcass sites, the bark marks at height, the oval ground depressions tend to occur at or above 5,500 feet in the Wallowa Mountains. Below that elevation is where the Dogman sign concentrates. The meadow bench where Dale camps, at approximately 4,600 feet, sits just below the boundary. The upper Imneha bench, where the guide and his client watched the pursuit event, is at approximately 5,800 feet above the boundary. The slope where the bipedal figure ran, going up into the talus toward the ridge, was heading higher. She does not know if this elevation boundary is a natural habitat preference, the way bears stay in the productive low elevations, and cougars concentrate in the broken rim country at mid-elevation, and wolverines work the high alpine country. It could simply be that the second entity prefers terrain above 5,500 feet for reasons of prey density or terrain type, or some other ecological factor she has not identified. Or the boundary could represent something else, a territory, a range claimed through active enforcement. She said that when she looked at the spatial pattern across her 12 sites, she thought about the way wolves establish territories in the Wallowa country, using scent marking and vocalizations, and, when territories overlap, direct confrontation. The wolves do not simply coexist with other wolves in the same terrain. They establish who owns what ground and they enforce it. She said the pattern she was looking at felt like something similar, a territorial enforcement, operating at a much larger geographic scale and at a level of behavioral sophistication that was, in her professional judgment as a wildlife ecologist who has spent her career studying territorial behavior in large carnivores, beyond what she would expect from any known species. The 6-year window she has data for is almost certainly not the full duration of whatever is happening. It is only the window she has been able to document. There is no reason to think this began in 2015 when she found the first tracks, or in 2017 when Dale first heard the two-tone call. Whatever she is looking at has the quality of something that has been in this landscape for a very long time and knows it well. Now, let me tell you about November of 2023. Dale went back into the Upper Minam for the November rifle elk season with 3 clients, all repeat customers he will not identify. 2 men from Boise and 1 from Twin Falls. They rode in on November 3rd to the same bench camp. The elk herd was in the lower elevations due to an early snowfall in the high country, good conditions for the camp. On November 5th, before first light, he heard the two-tone vocalization again. He had heard it many times since 2017. He got up and went to the meadow edge, the same way he always had. In the pre-dawn dark, he could not see anything. But this time, there was a response from the south timber, a single, long, descending vocalization. Not the two-tone call, something different in character, longer than the Dogman vocalization, dropping in pitch over its duration in a way that the two-tone call did not. He said it had a quality he associated with distress in large animals, though he was careful to tell me he is cautious about attributing emotional content to animal vocalizations. He said it was the kind of sound, in terms of frequency and duration and the way it fell toward the end, that a large animal makes when it is in pain or fear, based on his experience listening to horses and cattle in distress over his lifetime. The sound lasted about 4 seconds, then nothing. He sat at the meadow edge for 40 minutes. The sky lightened. Nothing moved in the meadow. He got his clients up, put them on a route north, and they rode away from the meadow. He stayed back under the pretense of checking a piece of camp equipment. When they were gone, he went to the south meadow edge and looked into the timber. He did not go in. He has a rule about that now, since 2022. He does not go into the south timber before there is light enough to see clearly. He looked from the edge and he could see that something had happened in the timber, broken branches visible at 60 yards, disturbed ground. But the light was not good enough yet, and he went back to camp. Clint Harwick killed a good bull on November 7th in the north drainage. The party packed out on November 8th. Dale stayed to break camp alone. On the morning of November 9th, with his clients on the trail heading out, he walked south along the river to the edge of the timber where the south meadow meets the trees. He went in. He found, in the timber about 40 yards from the meadow edge, a large area of disturbed ground, broken branches overhead and at shoulder height, soil dug or scraped over an area of perhaps 30 square feet. One mature Engelmann spruce, about 14 inches at the base, had been broken at 8 feet up, the teep section hanging in the adjacent trees, the break fresh and pale wooded. There was blood on the ground, a significant amount of blood, dark and already dry at the edges, in a roughly circular area about 12 feet across. In the center of the blood, the soil had been raked or depressed in a way that created an irregular depression, not a lying down shape, not what Dale would expect from a wounded or dead elk resting on its side. Something heavier and differently shaped had been in that spot for a while. There was no carcass. There was no bone. There was nothing visibly dead in the timber. He photographed what he found and sent the photographs to Celia. She drove up and hiked in 3 days later. The ground was still legible. She found things he had not noted. On 2 trees adjacent to the disturbance, at a height of between 5 and 6 feet, she found parallel gouges in the bark, 3 to 4 grooves per tree, evenly spaced, each approximately 6 inches long, pressed deep enough into the bark to reach the cambium beneath. She also found, at the edge of the disturbed soil, a single partial track. It was the left foot, she believed, based on orientation. 15 to 17 inches in length and 6 to 6.5 inches wide. She made a cast. She has the cast. She sent photographs to 2 wildlife biologists she trusts, one at Oregon State University in Corvallis and one at the University of Idaho in Moscow. Both confirmed the track did not match any known North American species. Both declined to make any further official comment. I asked Celia what she thinks the disturbance site represents. She said she does not know for certain. The blood volume was consistent with a large animal wound, a significant one. The soil disturbance was consistent with a struggle, or with a very heavy animal being present for an extended time. The absence of a carcass was consistent with either the animal recovering and leaving under its own power, or with the carcass being removed. She said she had looked carefully for any evidence of dragging, the kind of parallel groove marks in the soil that indicate a heavy object being hauled, and she found none. What she found instead, at the periphery of the disturbed area, going east toward the base of the North Ridge, was a series of depressions in the damp soil that could have been large footprints if the soil had not been disturbed by subsequent frost and partial thaw before she got there. She could not confirm them as tracks. She noted them in her records. She told me that the most straightforward reading of the evidence at the November site, taken alongside the vocalization Dale had heard on the 5th, is that a dogman was injured in the south timber at some point between the night of November 4th and the morning of November 5th. She said, there is no way to determine from the physical evidence alone whether that injury was the result of a confrontation with the second entity, or with something else entirely, or even in the outer range of possibility, with a large male elk during the rut, though she said the bark marks and the method of the soil disturbance were not consistent with an elk aggression event in her assessment. She said the most significant thing about the November site was the partial track, because the partial track at the disturbance site is not a dogman track. It is too wide, proportionally. Dogman tracks, as documented from the Minam drainage and from other northeastern Oregon sites in Celia's files, tend to run narrow relative to their length, consistent with an elongated, human-like foot. The track at the November site was 6 to 6.5 inches wide for a length of 15 to 17 inches, which is a significantly wider foot. It is also deeper than you would expect from a 15 to 17-inch track if the subject were approximately proportioned to a dogman of equivalent foot length. The depth of the impression in the soil type at that site, which Celia assessed as moderately compacted loam over a rock pan, suggested a subject weight in excess of 600 pounds. She said the track, combined with the bark marks, is the first physical evidence she has from within a disturbance site that appears to be from the second entity rather than from the dogman. Every other piece of evidence from the 12 sites has been indirect, the result of what was done rather than a trace of the thing that did it. The November site gave her what might be a direct trace. She is not ready to say what that means yet. She is a careful scientist, but she is not dismissing it. I drove back from La Grande in late May, the Wallowas going purple in the east behind me, and I thought about everything that adds up to this account. Dale on the tailgate in Enterprise in August, Russ Lund in March 2023, finally ready to talk about September 2019, and 4 stripped carcasses in a Hell's Canyon drainage. Celia Broadhurst, who spent 14 years as a careful and decorated field biologist in the large carnivore program, and left because the thing she found in the Minam drainage in January of 2015 could not be documented officially. Without consequences, she was not prepared to accept. The guide from the Upper Imnaha, who watched a pursuit event from a rocky outcrop and counted the seconds and then walked out that same day and did not go back that season. 11 other hunters and guides in northeastern Oregon who have accounts they have not filed officially because the professional cost of filing them is too high. And Terrence Ogle, the regional wildlife biologist from ODFW, who told Russ Lund in a phone call in 2019 that all known large predators in the state were accounted for under current monitoring. All known large predators. The phrase that assumes its own conclusion. The phrase that tells you, if you listen to it carefully, that the person saying it is aware there is something they have decided to categorize as unknown, and that the monitoring apparatus does not track the unknown. I want to tell you about one more conversation I had, because it adds something I have not been able to put down since I heard it. In the Nez Perce tradition, the Wallowa country was not simply hunting ground. The Wallowas were the homeland of the Wallowa Band, led most famously by Chief Joseph, who was born in the Wallowa Valley in 1840. The Nez Perce Treaty of 1855, negotiated at Walla Walla with Governor Stevens, reserved the Wallowa country for the Nez Perce. A subsequent treaty in 1863, signed by Nez Perce leaders who did not represent the Wallowa Band, and who the Wallowa Nez Perce did not recognize as having authority over their land, ceded the Wallowas to the federal government. The Wallowa Band resisted removal for 14 years, until the summer of 1877, when the U.S. Army pursued them across Idaho and Montana in the campaign that ended with Chief Joseph's surrender on October 5, 1877, 40 miles from the Canadian border. The Wallowa Nez Perce did not go home. The homeland they had been removed from was given over to white settlement and eventually to the National Forest System. I mention this because one of the people I spoke to while putting this account together was an elderly Nez Perce woman from Lapwai, Idaho, who asked me not to use her name. She has relatives who still have family connections to the Wallowa country, and she has spent time there herself. She is not a young woman. She grew up hearing stories from people who had grown up hearing stories from people whose parents had lived in the Wallowas before the removal. I asked her whether she had heard anything in those traditions about the kind of upright beings the guides and hunters had been describing. She said yes. She called them by a name in her language that she said roughly translated to the ones who walk like us but are not us, which she noted was a description that would apply to a great many things depending on the context. She said there were also accounts in the older stories of something in the high country above the Minam that was not the walking ones, something that was described as a boundary rather than a being, something that the walking ones themselves did not cross into, and that had always been there, in the high rock above the timberline, for as long as anyone could remember having stories about the country. She said she did not know what it was. She said the old people had not tried to give it a name, because the old people generally held that naming something was a claim of a certain kind of understanding, and they did not understand it. What they understood was that it was there, and that it was old, and that it had boundaries it enforced, and that the walking ones knew where those boundaries were, and stayed below them unless circumstances pushed them up. And when they were pushed up, the thing above the line pushed them back. She said this without drama, the way you say things that are simply true in your frame of reference. I asked her what she thought it was. She said she thought it was whatever it had always been. She said the Wallowas were very old country, and very old country has had time to develop arrangements that newer country has not, and it was not necessarily a person's business to understand every arrangement in a landscape, only to know they existed and to conduct themselves accordingly. Then she said that the people who were going into that country now, the hunters and guides and recreational users, were going in mostly without knowing the arrangements existed, and she said that ignorance of an arrangement does not exempt you from it. It just means you might stumble into it without understanding what you have walked into. I drove home. I thought about the two images from December 14th, 2022 on Dale's trail camera. The upright shape at the timber edge at 2:43 in the morning, generating enough body heat at 9 degrees to show up bright in a passive infrared sensor at 60 yards, still there at 2:47. Then gone. 4 minutes of something standing in the dark at the edge of the meadow, facing the camera directly, and then gone without triggering the sensor again as it departed. Dale went back into the upper Minim this past September, on a solo trail condition trip. He checked his trail camera. The camera had been knocked off its mounting tree at some point between April and September. It was on the ground with the mounting strap broken. The camera body was intact. He pulled the memory card. It had recorded 1,104 events from the spring and summer: elk, a black bear in June, a mule deer with a fawn in July, deer in August. Normal. The last image on the card was from September 9th, 12 days before Dale rode in, captured at 4:18 in the morning. Whatever angle the camera had after it fell, aimed partially at the ground, had caught one image. The image shows 3 or 4 feet of forest floor, and the lower section of the mounting tree, and a foot. 1 foot. The foot of something that has stepped very close to the camera, perhaps to look at it. The foot is bare. It is large, filling the lower portion of the frame. The image is sharp. Dale sent me a copy. I measured the foot in the image against the known diameter of the mounting tree, which Dale has tied horses to for 17 years and can give you the approximate circumference within an inch. The foot is 17 inches long. Dale is going back in for the October season as usual. His clients have booked and he has their deposits, and he is not a man who cancels on clients. He said the thing in the high country has never moved toward him, and the thing in the meadow has never moved toward him, and he has no reason to think that changes. He said something else at the end of our last conversation, sitting again on his tailgate, not in Enterprise this time, but at his house in Baker City, in the last of the summer evening light with the Wallowas visible as a blue wall to the northwest. He said that in 22 years of guiding that drainage, he had never once felt watched from both directions at the same time. This past season, for the first time, he does. He said it without self-pity or drama, the way he says most things. He is a person who has accepted that the country he works in is more than he can fully account for, and he has decided to keep working in it anyway, because it is his work and because the elk are there, and because he is not ready to give up the 17 years of accumulated knowledge that makes him good at what he does. That knowledge lives in him as much as in the green notebooks. It lives in his hands and his legs, and in the way he reads wind and the way he knows, without looking which way the drainage is going to funnel sound. He said the country had taught him everything he knew, and he supposed that was still true, even now. I cannot tell you what is in the Wallowa Mountains. I cannot tell you with certainty what Dale's trail camera photographed in December of 2022. I cannot tell you what Russ Lund found in that Hell's Canyon drainage in September of 2019, or what made those 4 carcasses clean. I cannot tell you what Celia Broadhurst's partial track cast represents, though two independent wildlife biologists at two separate universities have confirmed it does not match any species they can identify. What I can tell you is this. The Eagle Cap Wilderness is 360,000 acres of terrain that sees in a given year a small fraction of the human presence that comparably sized wilderness areas in the American West receive. The trails are steep and the weather is serious, and the access is genuinely difficult. There are drainages in there that have not been visited by any person since the previous hunting season, and drainages that have not been visited in years. It is the kind of country in which something could exist without being accounted for by any monitoring system, and in which accounts of things seen could pile up among the people who go there without ever reaching the agencies whose job it is to know what is in that landscape. That piling up has been happening for years. The accounts exist. The physical evidence exists. Celia Broadhurst's 12 sites exist, documented, photographed, partially cast. The track cast exists. The 2 trail camera images exist. Dale's 5 pages of October 2022 notebook entries exist, written in his small, careful cursive, describing something he watched at the East Meadow edge, recognize a threat, vocalize, and run. And somewhere above 5,500 feet in the Wallowa Mountains, in the hanging basins and the high talus above the timberline, whatever made those bark marks at 7 feet, and those oval ground depressions at the base of the trees, and those clean, methodical carcasses in the Hell's Canyon, draws is doing whatever it does. Patient, old, operating by rules that preceded the National Forest and the wilderness designation and the elk herd estimates and everything else the management apparatus has built around that country. The Nez Perce woman told me it was not necessarily a person's business to understand every arrangement in a landscape, only to know that the arrangements existed and to conduct themselves accordingly. If you guide in the Eagle Cap, if you hunt the upper Minam or the upper Imnaha or the east-facing drainages above the Hell's Canyon rim, if you ride into the Eagle Cap Wilderness in October and camp on a bench and hear, before first light, a sound that has 2 layers to it and drops into your chest before it reaches your ears, coming from somewhere up the drainage to the east, pay attention to what answers. And when you are lying in your tent and the horses are quiet and the country is dark and you hear something move through the south timber with a kind of speed that does not fit anything you have a category for, do not open the tent door. The country up there has arrangements you were not told about. The walking ones know where the boundary is, and something above the boundary is watching to see if they stay below it. It has been watching for a very long time. It is very patient, and it is not finished with whatever it is doing up there in the high basins above the Wallowa timberline, above the meadow benches, above the spruce and fir, in the old granite country above the line. Dale will be on that bench in October. The meadow will be there. The basalt wall with the broken snags will be there. At 2:43 in the morning, with the temperature at 9 degrees and a light snow beginning, something may stand at the timber edge again and look at where the camera used to be. He checked the tree before he rode out in September. The mounting bracket was still bolted to the bark, bent and empty, at exactly 7 feet off the ground. He measured it when he put the camera up in October of 2022. He had not told me what height he mounted it at. I asked him on the phone last week. 7 feet, he said. And then he was quiet for a moment, the way he gets quiet when something has landed. He said he had never thought about that before, that whatever knocked the camera down could reach a mount at 7 feet without effort, could reach it, look at it, and put it on the ground. He said he was going to think about that on the ride in next month. I told him to write it down. I want to go back to something Russ Lund told me, because I glossed over a detail earlier that I have been returning to. When Russ described the 4 carcasses he found in September of 2019, he spent most of our conversation on the physical condition of the carcasses and on the bark marks at the trees along the east edge of the clearing. But near the end of that conversation, he mentioned something else. Something he said he had almost not bothered telling me because it sounded too small against everything else. He said the clearing smelled wrong. He is a man who has spent 19 years in country where things die all the time. He knows what decomposing elk smells like in September when it is still warm, and he knows what a fresh kill smells like. And he knows what a scavenged carcass smells like after the bears and the ravens and the coyotes have worked it over. He said the clearing that morning did not smell like any of those things. He said it smelled like iron, the way blood smells, which he had expected from 4 carcasses. But underneath the iron, there was something else. He spent a long time trying to name it to me. He said it was a smell that reminded him of the air before a serious lightning storm, a charged quality, a sharpness, but mixed with something he associated with very deep, very cold water, cave water. The smell of a place that has not had air moving through it for a very long time and then suddenly does. He said the smell was strong at the 4 trees where the bark marks were, and lighter at the carcasses themselves, and that he had noticed this and thought about it and concluded that whatever had made the bark marks had been standing at those trees longer than it had spent on the carcasses. Whatever it had done to the carcasses, it had done quickly and then stood at the tree line for a long time afterward. He said he could not account for why something would mark a tree line after processing 4 elk carcasses. He said the only behavior it reminded him of, in terms of the spatial pattern of the marks and the time implied by the smell concentration, was the territorial marking behavior of wolves or cougars, the way a large carnivore announces its presence and its claim to a resource site. Except that wolves and cougars mark with scent glands and with claw rakes in the ground, and embark at a height consistent with their own bodies. The marks Russ found were at 7 feet. The smell was the wrong smell for any territorial marking behavior he knew. He has thought about this for 4 years. He said last winter he was reading something about the behavior of large carnivores at kill sites, a general wildlife biology text he had picked up at a used bookstore in Baker City. Not because he was trying to find an explanation for what he had seen, just because he reads that kind of thing. And he came across a description of kill site behavior in a territorial species that was relevant. The text described how some territorial carnivores, after a kill, will mark the perimeter of the kill site in a way that communicates not just presence and ownership, but information about the nature of the kill. That the marks are a form of communication directed at other members of their own species or at competing predators, and that the information encoded in the marking behavior can include the size and type of prey taken and the status of the individual doing the marking. He said when he read that, he sat with the book open for a while and thought about the 4 trees along the east edge of the clearing, each one marked at the same height, in the same manner, evenly spaced, deliberate and sequential. He said if that was marking behavior, it was more sophisticated marking behavior than anything he had documentation of in North American carnivores. And then he said something that I have not been able to let go of. He said if something was marking that clearing after those 4 carcasses, and marking it in a way that communicated information to something else that could read the marks, then there was something to communicate the information to. Something that could read those marks at 7 feet. Something that might come through that clearing and look at them. He said he had gone back to that drainage in September of 2020, a year after finding the carcasses. He had told himself he was going for preseason scouting, the same stated purpose as the year before. The carcasses were mostly gone by then, bones scattered by scavengers, the clearing returning to its ordinary character. The bark marks were still there, still legible at 7 feet. And at the base of the 3rd tree, the tree whose marks had been the deepest and most deliberate of the 4, he found a depression in the soil that had not been there in 2019. Oval, about the size of a bathtub, pressed perhaps 3 inches into the soil. The soil at the base of the depression had been packed smooth, the way soil gets packed when something has rested on it for a long time with significant weight. He did not measure the depression. He was not carrying measuring tape on a scouting trip. He estimated it at about 5 feet long and 2.5 feet wide. He took a photograph. I have seen the photograph. It is a depression in forest soil at the base of a ponderosa pine. It is not dramatic. It could be explained by many things: an elk bed, a bare wallow before the rains came, a soft place in the soil that collapsed under the weight of the tree roots. It could be explained by many things. He stayed in that clearing for about 20 minutes. He said the air was wrong the whole time he was there, the same charged quality as the year before, fainter but present, and he felt watched in a way that was different from the ordinary watch feeling you get in good bear country. He said the ordinary watched feeling has a specific character, a sensation of being assessed for threat or for opportunity, the calculus of a large mammal trying to decide what you are and whether you are a problem. What he felt in that clearing was not assessment, it was presence without the assessment, the feeling of being in the awareness of something that had already decided you were not relevant to what it was doing there, and was simply waiting for you to leave. He left. He has not gone back to that drainage for preseason scouting since. He routes his October trips through a different canyon to the north. He said his clients have not noticed the change, because the hunting is equally good in the northern canyon, and he has not offered an explanation. What would he say? I asked him that directly. What would you tell a client if you had to explain it? He said he would tell them the game sign showed more activity in the North Canyon this year, which is true. The elk have been concentrating to the north in recent seasons, and there is a credible ecological explanation for that which has nothing to do with anything he has seen. The willow regeneration on the north-facing slopes has improved the forage quality significantly since the Imnaha wolf pack began using the South Canyon more regularly and pushed the elk to the north. He is not lying to his clients. He is just not telling them everything. He said he thinks a lot of people in the guiding community are doing the same thing, not lying. Just not offering information that cannot be contextualized and would only alarm. He said the community's unofficial position on the Northeast Oregon backcountry is something like, "We know there is more in here than we can explain, and we work around it, and we do not advertise it," which is a rational position for people who depend on the land for their livelihood and who are not interested in either the attention that comes from talking about it publicly or the possibility that what they say could affect their client's willingness to come back. The guiding community in northeastern Oregon is not large. Enterprise and Joseph and Halfway and Richland and Wallowa, the little towns that ring the wilderness, have maybe 8,000 people combined. The ranching and the guiding and the outfitting that connect those communities to the wilderness are a significant part of the local economy and have been for generations. The guides who work that country know each other. They talk. And when I ask the guides who know each other whether there is more conversation in that community about what is in the backcountry than makes it into public accounts, they all say the same thing. Of course there is. They just say it is not useful to talk about it outside the community, because outside the community, the only available responses are dismissal, ridicule, or the wrong kind of attention. None of those are good for business, so the accounts stay inside. They circulate among the people who work the land and accumulate there, building into a body of knowledge that is not official and not published and not accessible to the monitoring apparatus, but that is very real to the people who carry it. Celia Broadhurst told me that one of the things that surprised her most when she started reaching out to guides and hunters in 2021 was how quickly people talked. Once they understood, she was not going to dismiss them and was not going to create a public controversy around their names. She said she had expected resistance, and there was some, but much less than she had anticipated. She said what she found instead was something that looked more like relief. People who had been holding something for years and were glad to have somewhere to put it. She said the accumulation of accounts she has gathered in 4 years represents, by her estimate, decades of observations from people who go into the Wallowa wilderness regularly. Some of the guides she spoke to had first encounters going back to the 1980s and 1990s. One man, a retired outfitter in his late 70s from the Halfway area, told her about a September evening in 1988 when he and 2 clients were glassing a high basin on the east face of the Eagle Cap and watched through good glass a large dark bipedal figure move at significant speed across a talus field at approximately 8,000 feet elevation. He said at the time he had told himself it was a bear because that was the category available to him. He had gone back to that basin multiple times in subsequent years and watched the same slopes carefully. He had never been able to reproduce the sighting on a bear. Bears do not move across talus at that speed. Bears do not hold a fully erect posture on steep talus, which requires a very different weight distribution than a quadruped uses. He had decided by 1995 that it had not been a bear and had carried that conclusion privately for 25 years. He told Celia the detail he had never told anyone else. He said the figure he had seen in that high basin in September of 1988 was moving from north to south across the talus. He had watched it for about 3 minutes before it moved into the shadow of the ridge and was gone. And during those 3 minutes, it had turned its head twice and looked directly in his direction, despite the fact that he and his clients were approximately 800 yards away, across the basin. Glassing from below the ridge in conditions that should have made them invisible, it saw them, and it looked at them twice and continued moving south, not running, not changing its pace, just registering their presence and continuing on its route. He said the part that had stayed with him across 30 years was that it had continued on its route. Whatever it was doing in that high basin, moving south across the talus, was more important to it than the 3 people on the opposite rim with binoculars. They were noticed and then irrelevant. He said he had spent 25 years thinking about what that implied about the nature of the thing he had seen, and about what it was doing up there that was important enough that 3 observers were not worth altering course for. He told Celia that the basin where he had seen it in 1988 was above 7,500 feet, well above the timberline, well above the upper limit of the Dogman sightings in the low-elevation drainage country. He said in 30 years of subsequent trips to that mountain, he had seen bipedal figures in the timber drainage country at the 4,500 to 5,500 foot elevations on multiple occasions. He had never again seen anything in the high basin above 7,500 feet. Whatever he had seen up there in 1988 was the only time he had seen something in that elevation range. Celia told me she does not know what to do with the 1988 account in terms of her 2-entity framework. The elevation is significantly above her documented boundary for the second entity. She does not know if the thing seen in the high basin that September was the second entity doing something in its own high elevation territory, or whether the elevated basin sighting is a separate category that she does not yet have enough data to characterize. She noted that 800 yards of distance across difficult terrain in September light, even with good binoculars, is at the edge of reliable identification. She accepts the retired outfitter's characterization of bipedal, large, and dark, and she accepts his description of the posture on the talus, which is consistent with a true biped and not consistent with a bear. She is uncertain about everything else. She said that one of the things she has learned in 4 years of doing this work informally is that uncertainty is not the same as absence. The wildlife management apparatus operates on the principle that what cannot be documented does not exist for management purposes. That is a workable principle when your monitoring system is adequate to the landscape you are managing. It is a less workable principle in 360,000 acres of terrain, where large portions have not been systematically surveyed since the wilderness designation in 1940. She said that the Hells Canyon National Recreation Area on the Idaho side of the Snake River, which is managed by the U.S. Forest Service, has a monitoring program that includes periodic aerial surveys, camera trap networks, and systematic track surveys on established routes. She said the Oregon side of the Hells Canyon country, the Wallowa-Whitman National Forest above the canyon rim, has no equivalent systematic monitoring program for large mammals beyond the wolf telemetry network and the bear population assessment conducted every 5 to 8 years. The ungulate monitoring is done primarily through hunter-harvest data and aerial surveys of winter range. This is a large-scale monitoring approach adequate for population-level management of known species. It is not designed to detect the presence of unknown or undocumented species. She said if you wanted to design a monitoring system that would detect something new, something that had not been previously characterized, you would need systematic track surveys, camera trap networks covering representative portions of the terrain at multiple elevations, and acoustic monitoring to characterize vocalization patterns. The Wallowa Wilderness has none of those things operating at any meaningful spatial coverage. The things that Dale and Russ and the guides have been observing for decades have been observed entirely outside of any monitoring framework. The evidence Celia is assembling is the first systematic attempt to characterize the pattern, and she is doing it without institutional support, without funding, and without the kind of official sanction that would allow her to collect biological samples or operate camera traps on federal wilderness land, without filing permits that would trigger exactly the kind of attention she is not prepared to invite. She said she is not complaining about this. It is the situation she is in, and she is working within it. She said the thing that concerns her most, going forward, is not the question of what is in the Wallowa Wilderness. Whatever is there has apparently been there for a very long time, and has demonstrated a capacity to coexist with significant human activity in the surrounding areas, the towns, the ranches, the guiding operations, the hunting seasons, all of it, without any kind of serious conflict. The Wallowa country has had human activity of various kinds for thousands of years, and whatever arrangements exist in that landscape have accommodated that activity without catastrophic breakdown. What concerns her is the rate of change. The Wallowa Mountains have been experiencing significant climate-driven habitat changes over the past 20 years. The subalpine fir zone, which represents the upper limit of the Dogman habitat based on her documented sightings and track data, has been moving upslope as the timberline advances in response to warming temperatures. The meadow systems at the 4,500 to 5,500 foot elevations, like the meadow on Dale's Bench, have been drying and losing productivity as precipitation patterns shift and summer temperatures increase. The elk populations, while still significant, have been showing signs of nutritional stress in dry years, and the distribution of elk within the wilderness has been changing, with animals spending more time in the higher elevation country that offers better forage quality as the lower elevation meadows decline. What this means ecologically is that the habitat boundary between the lower elevation Dogman country and the higher elevation terrain above Celia's documented boundary is shifting. The zone of productive habitat where the Dogman sightings and track evidence have historically been concentrated is getting pushed upward, and upward is the direction of the second entity's apparent territory. She said she does not know what happens when those two things press against each other more than they currently do. The accounts she has suggest that the second entity actively enforces its territorial boundary. The speed and consistency of the Dogman, departures from areas following disturbance events, the disappearance of Dogman sign from drainages where the carcasses and bark marks appear, all of that is consistent with active territorial enforcement rather than passive avoidance. If the habitat changes continue to push the Dogman upslope, and if the second entity responds to encroachment as consistently as the evidence suggests it does, the result over the coming decades could be a significant reduction in the Dogman population in the Wallowa wilderness. She said she is aware that this is a strange sentence for a wildlife ecologist to say about a species that officially does not exist. She said the strangeness of the sentence does not make it less worth saying. I asked Dale last week, in the phone call, where he told me about the camera mounting height, whether he had noticed any change in the frequency or character of the observations from the bench camp in recent years compared to the 2017 to 2019 period. He said yes. He said the two-tone vocalization, which he had been hearing 3 to 5 times per season between 2017 and 2020, had become less frequent since 2021. He had heard it twice in 2021, once in 2022, twice in 2023, and once so far this season. He said the meadow observations, the sightings of bipedal figures at the East Timber Edge, had also become less frequent. He had 4 sightings between 2017 and 2020. He had had one in 2021, the 2022 observation of the single standing figure in the pre-dawn meadow, and the pursuit event that followed it, and nothing in 2023. He had heard the November 2023 vocalization from the South Timber, but had not seen anything in the meadow that season. He said the bench camp was producing as well as it ever had, in terms of elk. The herd was still there, still using the meadow, still coming off the high country in October, the way they always had. It was not the prey that was becoming less present, it was the other things. He said he did not know what to make of that trend. I told him about the elevation boundary that Celia had described, about the 12 sites clustered above 5,500 feet, about the 7 sites with prior Dogman sign that had gone quiet following the disturbance events. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that I did not expect. He said, "You know, the country around here has been different for a while. Not just the Meenam. The drainage north of the bench, the one I take clients into when I don't want them in the meadow, that drainage had Dogman sign through about 2020. Tracks, vocalizations, one sighting from a client in 2019 who I told to put it down to a bear. Since 2021, that drainage has been quiet. Nothing. He said he had attributed it to the drought years, the way the animal distribution shifts in dry years. The north drainage had lower water availability than usual from 2020 to 2022, which would push the elk and other animals toward the wetter south drainage. He had attributed the change to that, and he still thought that was a partial explanation. But he said that when he thought about Celia's pattern, the way the Dogman sign was disappearing from areas following the disturbance events, he thought the drought was probably not the full explanation for the north drainage. He said the timing was wrong. The drought had not really hit hard until late summer 2021, but the north drainage had been quiet since early 2021, before the drought had fully set in. He said he had not put those two things together before. He sat with that for a moment on the phone. I could hear the quality of the silence, the particular quiet of a person who was rearranging things in their head and not ready to say what the new arrangement looks like. Then he said, "So it's further along than we thought." He meant the territory, the line moving, the clearing, if that is what it is, progressing. He said he was going to ride into the north drainage on the way into camp in October. He said he wanted to look at it with the new framework and see if there was anything he had missed because he had been attributing it to the drought. He said he would write it down. I believe him. The last thing I want to tell you comes from a conversation I had with a retired Oregon State Police detective named Gerald Pruitt, who spent 21 years in the Eastern Oregon District before retiring to a ranch outside of Halfway in 2019. Halfway is a small community in Baker County, about 40 miles south of Enterprise, at the base of the Wallowa Mountains on the east side. The community sits at the edge of the Hells Canyon country, the same terrain Russ Lund guides. Gerald has a small cattle operation, and he guides mule deer hunters in the fall as a retirement activity. He is not a man who chases unusual stories. He spent 21 years working with evidence, and in his professional view, most unusual stories fall apart under the weight of their own inconsistencies. He is, in the phrasing of the law enforcement world, a skeptic by training. He contacted me 3 months ago because he had read something I had written about the Dogman accounts from the Pacific Northwest, and he had a question. His question was whether I had ever encountered accounts from northeastern Oregon, specifically, that involved tracks found at a size and weight inconsistency beyond what the standard Dogman description would suggest. He described what he meant, not the 14 to 16-inch tracks at the stride lengths, consistent with a large biped of the kind that the guides and hunters had been describing. Something larger, something where the depth of the impression in hard soil suggested a weight significantly greater than the 600 to 700 pound range that people typically attributed to Dogman based on the track proportions. I told him I had. I told him about the November 2023 site and Celia's assessment. He was quiet for a moment. Then he told me his account. In October of 2020, on a late-season mule deer trip with 2 clients from Nevada, he had been working the canyon country about 6 miles above the town of Richland, on a south-facing slope above a dry creek bed that runs into the Snake River drainage. They had come in from the east on a rough 2-track that ends at a Forest Service gate and hiked in about 3 miles from there. The terrain is steep and broken, and they had split up, Gerald working the upper country while his clients moved along the creek bottom. At approximately 1400, he found tracks in a section of clay soil exposed on a south-facing cut slope. The soil was damp from a light rain 2 days earlier and had been holding prints well. He found elk tracks first, and then deer tracks, and then something that stopped him. He found a single track in the clay. One complete impression, the left foot, he thought, because of the way the weight distribution moved through the print. The print was 19 inches long. He measured it against his boot, which he knows is 11.5 inches long, so the comparison was approximate but consistent. He estimated the width at 7.5 to 8 inches. The depth of the impression in the clay was significant. He pressed his own boot into the clay nearby, using his full body weight of 210 pounds at the time, and sank about 1/4 inch. The large track was pressed approximately 2 inches into the same clay. He is a former investigator. He did the rough calculation. A 2-inch depression in that clay substrate at his weight implied a subject weight in the 1,600 to 1,800 pound range, which is the weight of a very large bull elk or a mature dairy cow. But the track was bipedal in its weight distribution, with the weight centered on the midfoot and the toes, not distributed across a hoof. It was not an elk track. He knows elk tracks as well as he knows anything. He photographed it. He spent about 20 minutes at the site looking for other tracks. He found 2 partial impressions further up the slope that he believed were from the same subject, too degraded to measure, but consistent in size with what he had found in the clay. He found no other tracks of any kind near the impression. No approach tracks, no departure tracks on the surrounding substrate, which was hard rock and dry grass and would not have held impressions. He said the thing that distinguished his response from what a civilian might have done in the same situation was that he assessed it professionally. He looked at the evidence the way he would look at a scene. He asked himself what the evidence showed and what it did not show, and what alternative explanations existed. He came up with no alternative explanation that fit the physical evidence. The weight implied by the impression depth was too great for any known bipedal animal in North America. The track morphology was clearly bipedal and not consistent with any quadruped he was familiar with. The absence of approach tracks on the surrounding hard substrate was interesting, but not diagnostic, because the hard substrate simply would not hold impressions, and a large animal moving on hard rock is not going to leave a record of its passage. None of the evidence was diagnostic in the sense of ruling out every other explanation. But the combination of the size, the weight estimate, and the bipedal morphology did not fit any animal he was aware of. He called his clients in from the creek bottom, said he wanted to check a different area, and move the group out of that section of canyon. He did not tell his clients what he had found. He did not file any kind of report with ODFW or the Forest Service. He photographed the track and went home. He said he had thought about it for 3 years before contacting me. He said the thing that had kept him from dismissing it was the weight estimate. He is a careful person, and he knew his methodology was rough and subject to error. But even with significant error margins, the weight implied by that impression in that clay was not consistent with anything in any wildlife database he had accessed in his 21 years working that country. He said what troubled him more than the track itself was that whatever made it had been moving in country that he and his clients were actively using in daylight, and there was no indication from his clients or from any sign at the site that the subject had been disturbed or alarmed by their presence in the canyon. The 2 partial impressions further up the slope, which he estimated were earlier in the subject's line of travel based on the direction they pointed, were not moving away from the creek bottom where his clients were working. They were moving across the slope, on a bearing that would have taken the subject toward the drainage above, going up, moving toward the higher country. He said he had not hunted that specific canyon again after 2020. He did not offer his clients the area in subsequent seasons. He said the hunting in the adjacent canyons was equally good, and he had not needed to justify the change. I asked Gerald what he thought he had found in the clay slope in October of 2020. He said that in his professional life, he had been trained not to name things he could not demonstrate. He could demonstrate the track. He could demonstrate the approximate size. He could demonstrate that the morphology was bipedal. and did not match any known species. That was what the evidence showed. He said the only thing he was prepared to add to that was that in 21 years of working Eastern Oregon, he had heard, secondhand and in fragments and never in any official context, enough similar accounts from enough credible people in enough separate locations to conclude that there was something in the Wallowa country that he did not have a name for, and that the agencies responsible for managing that country were either not tracking or were tracking without making the information available. He said he was not sure which of those was true. He said it was possible both were true simultaneously in different parts of the agency. Then he said something that I thought about on the drive home from halfway. He said that in his career as a detective, the cases that turned out to be the most serious were rarely the ones that arrived with a lot of noise and obvious indicators. They were the quiet ones. The cases where the evidence accumulated slowly across multiple jurisdictions and multiple witnesses and never quite reached the threshold that would trigger a formal investigation, because each individual data point was ambiguous, or could be explained in isolation. But the aggregate pattern, when you stood back far enough to see all of it at once, told a very clear story. He said the Wallowa Mountain accounts, taken one at a time, were all ambiguous. Track finds can be misidentified. Carcass conditions can be attributed to wolf depredation. Vocalizations can be attributed to known species. Bark marks can be attributed to bear activity or storm damage. Trail camera images taken at distance and infrared can be misread. Any single account, in isolation, can be walked back to a more comfortable explanation. He said the problem, from his perspective, was not any one of those accounts. The problem was all of them together, in the same geography over the same time period, describing the same set of physical characteristics, reported by people who did not know each other and had not coordinated their accounts. He said that pattern, in his professional framework, was not the pattern of misidentification and misinterpretation. That pattern was the pattern of real. I drove home from halfway in October light, the Wallowas going orange and gold to the north, the Snake River country opening up to the east as I dropped down into the Baker Valley. I thought about Dale on his bench in October, watching the meadow in the first gray light. I thought about Russ standing in that clearing in September 2019, 2 hours, walking around 4 carcasses and trying to find an explanation in his existing categories and not finding one. I thought about Celia hiking in on snowshoes in January 2015, 22 miles round trip, to measure tracks that her employer subsequently erased from the official record. I thought about Gerald Pruitt pressing his boot into clay on a south-facing slope in October 2020 and calculating the weight of something that had stood there before him. And I thought about the Knees Purse woman from Lapwai, who said that ignorance of an arrangement does not exempt you from it, only means you might stumble into it without understanding what you have walked into. The Wallowa Mountains have been there for a very long time. The people who know them best know that they hold more than the land management agencies have characterized, and they mostly keep that knowledge inside the community because there is no safe place outside the community to put it. The ones who have gone outside the community with pieces of it, people like Celia, who was willing to leave a career rather than file a false report, have paid a price for doing so. The account I have put together here is incomplete. I know it is incomplete. Celia knows it is incomplete. Dale knows it. Russ knows it. Gerald Pruitt, with his detective's training and his refusal to name what he cannot demonstrate, knows it as well as anyone. What we have is a pattern that points towards something we cannot yet fully describe. What we have is the shape of something very large, very old, and very present in a wilderness that most people will never visit, and that the monitoring apparatus is not equipped to see. What we have is enough to know that the question is real. I will keep going into this. I will keep talking to the guides and the hunters and the retired wildlife biologists and the former law enforcement officers who know that country and who carry pieces of this account in them. I will keep listening. I will keep writing things down. And when Dale calls me in November to tell me what he found in the north drainage, I will have the notebook open. He will call. I know him well enough to know that. Whatever he finds up there, he will write it down first and call me second, because that is the kind of man he is. And when he calls, his voice will be flat and even, the way it was on that tailgate in Enterprise in August. The voice of a man who has decided that saying a thing out loud is the last tool available, and he might as well use it. The country up there is waiting. It has been waiting for a very long time. Whatever arrangements exist in that old granite wilderness, above the meadow benches, above the spruce and fir, in the high basins where the tracks that do not belong to any cataloged species press 2 inches into clay on south-facing slopes in October. Those arrangements are ongoing. They were in place before the wilderness designation. They were in place before the national forest. They were in place before the first settlers came over the Blue Mountains and looked north at the Wallowas and thought about what might be worth going in to claim. Whatever is up there, it has been working on its own terms, by its own timeline, in its own country, for long enough that the people who know the land best have stopped wondering if it is real and started wondering quietly and carefully what it is doing and when it will be finished. Dale does not know the answer to that. Neither does Celia. Neither does Russ Lund, standing in a clearing in the Hells Canyon country, with 4 clean carcasses and bark marks at 7 feet, trying to decide what he is looking at. But they are paying attention. They are writing things down. And that is where it starts. I want to tell you about one more person before I close this out, because she adds something to the history of this country that none of the other sources I have described can provide. Her name is Vivian Holt. She is 74 years old, and she has lived in Wallowa County her entire life. Her family goes back 4 generations in the valley, to great-grandparents who homesteaded above the town of Wallowa in the 1890s and ran cattle on forest allotments through the 1940s and 1950s. She taught school and enterprise for 31 years, and she has, in her retirement, been doing something she started as a personal project in 2009 and has continued quietly since, which is collecting written accounts from the families of old-timer ranchers and guides in Wallowa County, the kind of material that ends up in shoeboxes and drawer bottoms and gets thrown out when a property sells or an estate is settled. She contacted me after she heard through people she knew in the ranching community that I was asking questions about the backcountry. She wanted to show me something. We met in her kitchen in Wallowa in September, a few weeks after I sat with Dale on his tailgate in Enterprise. She had a cardboard box on her kitchen table, and she opened it while we talked. Inside the box was a collection of material going back to the 1920s, letters, fragments of field notebooks. One small diary with a cracked leather cover, 2 typed pages from what appeared to be a county agricultural report from 1947. She had assembled this over 15 years from 9 separate families in the county, and she had not shared it with anyone beyond a local historical group that had published a small portion of it in a newsletter with the unusual material left out. She showed me the 1947 agricultural report pages first. They were routine in most of their content: grazing allotment conditions, forage availability, water access reports from the high country allotments. But in a section on allotment conditions in the Upper Minam watershed, there was a paragraph that the county agent, a man named Harold Vaz, had written, and then apparently tried to have removed from the final report. It was still in the pages Vivian had, because the pages were a draft copy, not the filed version. Vaz wrote, in the matter-of-fact language of a county agricultural report, that several allotment holders in the Upper Minam and Upper Imnaha country had reported unusual elk mortality in the summer of 1947. Specifically, that elk were found in a condition inconsistent with predator activity or disease, that hide removal and organ absence were noted by multiple separate ranchers in separate drainages, and that the allotment holders had independently concluded that something in the high country above 6,000 feet was responsible and had without exception moved their stock to lower allotments for the remainder of the grazing season. Voss noted that he had visited 2 of the sites himself and could confirm the unusual condition of the carcasses. He had no explanation to offer. In the filed version of the 1947 report, that paragraph does not appear. Vivian had found the filed version in the county records and compared it to the draft. The paragraph had been removed before filing. She did not know whether Vaz had removed it himself or whether someone else had asked him to. She showed me the diary next. It belonged to a rancher named Emmett Searcy, who had run cattle on a high allotment above the Minam from the late 1920s through 1951. The diary covered 3 seasons, 1938, 1939, and 1940. Vivian had found it in a box of Searcy family papers that a granddaughter in Portland had been about to throw out. The granddaughter had no idea what the diary contained. She had given the box to Vivian without going through it because Vivian had a reputation in the county for wanting exactly that kind of material. Searcy's diary entries were brief and functional: water levels, cattle conditions, weather, trail quality. But in the summer of 1939, across about 6 weeks of entries in July and August, there was a thread that ran through the otherwise practical observations. Searcy wrote that his cattle were not using the upper sections of the allotment. The sections above what he estimated was about 6,000 feet, despite good grass. Cattle that had used those sections without difficulty in previous years were staying at the lower elevation, regardless of forage conditions. He drove them up twice, and both times they came back down on their own by the following morning. He checked the upper sections himself on August 3rd and wrote that the grass up there was the best grass on the allotment and that there was nothing he could see that would account for why the cattle would not stay. Then, on August 19th, 1939, he wrote an entry that Vivian showed me with her finger pointing to the specific line. Cersei had gone up to the high sections again on horseback, alone. He had found 4 elk in a small meadow below the ridge, all of them dead, all of them in a condition he described only as not right, and had turned his horse around and come back down. He wrote that he had asked an old-timer in the valley, a man he identified only as Jess, about what he had seen. Jess had told him that what was up there was old and that it had always been there, and that you gave it the upper country and it left everything below the line alone. Cersei wrote that he did not go back to the upper sections for the rest of that season, and that he had moved his cattle to a lower allotment the following year. Vivian had found 3 other documents in her collection that touched on the same pattern. A letter from 1923 between 2 ranchers discussing a summer when their cattle had refused the high allotment and they had found, on a solo check, elk in a condition that one of them described as opened but not eaten, which is as precise a description of the carcass condition Russ found in 2019 as anything I have come across. A fragment of a field notebook from an undated period, probably the 1930s based on the paper quality, in which someone whose name was not on the notebook wrote about a vocalization from the upper ridge that had 2 sounds in it at once, which he had never heard from any animal he knew and which his dog had refused to approach. A 2-page typed summary from a 1961 meeting of the Wallowa County Cattlemen's Association, in which, in a brief section on allotment conditions, someone had noted that the upper minimum allotments were producing below their historical average, and that several members had voluntarily moved their stock to lower ground, with the explanation that there was an intermittent disturbance in the high country that their stock were responding to. No further explanation was given, and no further questions were recorded as asked. These documents span 40 years, from 1923 to 1961. They are not connected to each other by any explicit chain of knowledge. The people who wrote them were not in communication about what they had found, and were not trying to build a case. They were ranchers and county agents writing in the ordinary course of their work, noting something unusual and moving on. The consistency of what they describe across 4 decades and multiple independent observers is not the product of coordination. It is the product of a consistent reality that multiple careful people encountered and recorded, and, in most cases, kept inside the ranching community the same way the guiding community keeps its accounts inside today. Vivian told me that she had been sitting with this material for 15 years, and she had her own conclusion about it, which was that the thing in the high country above the Menam had been there long before any of the people writing these documents were born, and would be there long after anyone now living was gone. She said the old ranching families had understood this without making much of it, the way you understand that the river floods in big snow years, and you build accordingly. You do not need to explain a flood to build above the flood line. You just need to know where the line is. She said the line in the Wallowa high country had been known and respected by the families who worked that land for over a century. What she found worrying about the current period was not that the thing was there. It had always been there. What worried her was that the institutional knowledge of where the line was had been eroding. The old ranching families had passed the knowledge person to person across generations, the way Jess had passed it to Cersei in August of 1939. But that transmission had been disrupted. The families who carried the knowledge had sold out or moved on, or simply run out of generations to pass it to, and the new people coming into the country, the outfitters and guides and recreational users and wilderness managers, were coming in without it. She said a line that no one knows about is the same as a line that does not exist for practical purposes. And a line that does not exist is a line that people walk across. She closed the cardboard box. We sat in her kitchen for a while. She made more coffee. Outside the window, the Wallowa Valley was going gold in the September afternoon, the kind of light that makes that country look like it was designed to be looked at from exactly this angle. She said she was glad someone was finally putting it together. She said she had been waiting a long time for someone to connect the ranching history to the guiding accounts to the official record, to show that this was not new and was not going away and was not going to be managed by pretending the line did not exist. I told her I was going to write it down. She said she knew that. She said that was why she had called me. One more thing, and I say this because it would be unfair to leave it out. In the days after I sat with Dale on that tailgate in Enterprise and he told me about the upper Minam drainage and what he had seen in 7 years of mornings at the meadow edge, I drove north through Wallowa County and stopped in the town of Wallowa, which is a small community of about 800 people at the far eastern end of the Wallowa Valley. I was not looking for anything specific. I was driving and thinking, and I stopped at a diner on the main street for coffee and found myself in a conversation with a woman behind the counter who had grown up in Wallowa County and had spent most of her life there. She was in her early 60s, had worked the counter at that diner for 20 years, and she knew everyone who came through. I was not trying to gather information. I was having coffee and she was making conversation, the way people do in small towns when a stranger comes in and does not seem to be in a hurry. She asked me what I was doing in the county. I said I was doing some research on the backcountry and the people who work in it. She asked what kind of research. I said I was interested in accounts from hunters and guides about what they had seen out there. She was quiet for a moment. She refilled my coffee without being asked. Then she said, "Are you talking about the walking ones or the other kind?" I set down my cup. I said I was interested in both. She said she had grown up hearing about both of them from her grandfather, who had been a rancher in the Upper Valley in the 1940s and 1950s, and who had run cattle on allotments in the National Forest every summer. She said her grandfather had seen the walking ones, what she called by a name in the Nez Perce language that she approximated in English as the tall ones who share the country, on 3 separate occasions across a 20-year period. He had never been frightened by them. He had regarded them the way he regarded the bears and the cougars and the wolves, as animals that belonged to the country, and that a person who worked in that country needed to know about and respect. He had rules for working near them, rules he had learned from Nez Perce neighbors in the valley. He had passed those rules to her mother, and her mother had passed them to her. She said the other kind was different. Her grandfather had not seen the other kind, but he had found what it left behind once, on a late summer allotment check in the high country above the Mainam in the 1950s sometime. He had found elk in a condition he had never seen before and had not been able to explain to his satisfaction in the remaining years of his life. He described the condition to her mother, who described it to her. The description matched, in its essential details, what Russ Lund had described to me: the hide, the organs, the cleanness of it, the trees with the marks at height. Her grandfather had concluded, from asking around among the older ranching families in the valley, that there had been accounts of this kind going back to the first decades of the 20th century in the high country above the valley. He had not tried to explain it and had not tried to do anything about it. He had gotten his cattle off the high allotment for the season and had not run them on that specific allotment again, because he was a practical man and he did not need to understand a thing completely in order to understand that it existed and that the appropriate response to it was to give it room. She said that was the attitude she had grown up with, and it was the attitude she had passed on to her own children, who had grown up in the valley and 2 of whom still lived there. The high country above the Mainam had things in it that did not need to be interfered with. You learned where the lines were, and you stayed on the right side of them. You did not go looking for explanations. You just gave things room. I asked her how she knew where the lines were. She said you learned from the people who had been learning for a long time. You watched what the animals avoided. You paid attention to the vocalizations, where they came from and in what direction they moved. You noticed which parts of the high country the elk stayed out of in certain seasons, and you noticed when the ravens were present and when they were absent. Because ravens follow large predators, and their absence in a drainage tells you something about what kind of presence is in there that a raven would not want to be near. You learned to read the sign the way anyone learns to read any language, slowly, with help from people who had been reading it longer. She said the people in the valley who worked the backcountry had been reading it in this way for generations. The official categories, what ODFW classified and monitored and issued harvest reports about, were a subset of what was actually in the country. Everyone who worked that land knew this. It was not a secret exactly. It was more like information that existed in a register that the official management apparatus did not access. She refilled my coffee again. The diner was mostly empty. It was a Wednesday morning in late summer, and the tourist season was winding down. She said the thing that had changed in recent years, in her observation from behind that counter and from talking to the guides and hunters and ranchers who came through, was that the sign from the high country was different. Not the walking ones, the other kind. The account she had from her grandfather, the cleared elk on the high allotment in the 1950s, had been a single episode and had not repeated in subsequent seasons on that allotment. Her grandfather had concluded whatever was in that country had moved on. But the accounts she was hearing in recent years from people she trusted were more frequent. The disturbance events, or things consistent with disturbance events, were being found across more drainages, and the people finding them were noting that the usual sign from the walking ones, the tracks and the vocalizations that the guides had been calibrating their routes around for decades, was going quiet in those drainages afterward. She said the old people she had known who were still alive always said that when the sign went quiet from the walking ones in a place they had been using, it did not mean they had gone somewhere else. It meant something had changed the balance in that place. And when the balance changed, you did not go looking for the cause. You noted the change, you adjusted your routes, and you waited to see what settled. She said she thought the balance was changing in the upper Mainam country. She had thought so for 2 or 3 years. She did not know what it meant for the long run. Nobody she had talked to knew either. I thanked her for the coffee and the conversation. She said something as I was leaving that I have not stopped thinking about. She said, "Those boys who go up there every fall with their horses and their rifles and think they know that country, they know it better than most. But knowing a place in the way a hunter knows it is not the same as knowing it in the way the country knows itself. The country up there has a memory that goes back a lot further than any of us, and what it remembers is not always convenient." I went out to my truck and sat for a minute, and then drove south out of Wallowa County back toward Baker City with the mountains at my back and everything they held. The country up there has a memory. I believe that. I have believed it for a long time, in the way you believe things that you can feel are true before you can demonstrate that they are. The accounts I have laid out here, from Dale and Russ and Celia and Gerald and the Nez Perce woman from Lapwai and the woman in the diner in Wallowa who refilled my coffee twice and told me about her grandfather's high allotment in the 1950s, all of those accounts are pieces of a memory that the country is holding, and that the people who know the country well enough are beginning, carefully and slowly, to read. I do not know what they will find when they read it fully, but I think it is worth reading. I think the effort of putting these pieces together, the way Celia has been putting them together for 4 years in her personal files, the way Dale has been putting them together in his green field notebooks for 7 years, is worth the making. Because the alternative is to accept the official categories and leave the rest in the register that the management apparatus does not access, which means leaving it in the keeping of the country alone. The country has been keeping it for a very long time. It does not need our help to hold it. But it might be better for everyone, for the people who work that land, and for whatever is in it, if the people who can read the sign start talking about what they see before the balance shifts too far in a direction that is harder to recover from. Dale will be in the meadow in October. The notebooks will be full by November. Whatever is up there will still be there when the snow comes. And sometime next spring, when the country opens again and the first pack strings go back in and the guides start planning their fall routes, someone will ride into a drainage that was productive last year and find it quiet, and they will note it and they will adjust their route, and they will not talk about it publicly, but they will know. They will know the way the people who work that country have always known, through the accumulation of small, careful observations made by people paying close attention over a very long time, that there is more in the Wallowa Mountains than the official record contains. And the country will keep its memory. It always has.